All right, hello world. This is CS50 on Twitch. My name is Colton Ogden, and today we're going to venture again into web development. So last stream we implemented Cookie Clicker. We had an amazing community-created game that we also showcased at the end. So thanks again to all the folks involved in doing that. Asli, Andre, Bella, and Irene. That was awesome. Today we're stepping away from games, and we're going to start talking about one of the most popular programming languages in the world today. And that language is JavaScript. Today's stream is going to be a little on the basic side, so we're only going to be covering the very basics, the syntax. We'll do some basic DOM manipulation, and then we'll load Bootstrap up with JavaScript and take a look at how it changes once we actually start integrating that versus just the CSS part of Bootstrap. Shout out to everybody in the chat. We have a bunch of people that are super excited apparently to learn JavaScript today. So AL0099, Nafis, Rahul Ranjan, Chinaski, Blackbeard 0001, Kinetic Kandra, Killer OM, Whipstreak23 saying, and that's Nate saying that they are very excited to learn JavaScript. Nate's been featured on stream before as showing his HTML and CSS project when we did our code review stream, so stay tuned for some more of those in the near future. And then Asli as well. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Rahul asking, how was your birthday? Birthday was awesome. Just kind of hung out, kept it kind of mellow. The folks that I just mentioned put together an awesome, if you haven't watched the last stream, the Cookie Clicker stream, where they put together that game, that happy birthday game, was super awesome. So check out that last stream, the last 20 minutes or so, the Cookie Clicker stream. It's here on Twitch still at the time of this recording. And if you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be in the YouTube video. And yeah, it was awesome. I was kind of blown away, a little bit speechless when I actually watched it. We got lots of people. We got folks from Yemen, from Turkey. We got folks from India, folks from all over the world. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. Let's talk about, I guess, some folks are asking what's the agenda for today's stream. Today's stream, we're going to be covering kind of the syntax of JavaScript and a few small examples to start off, some basic prompts. We're going to implement a to-do list. The to-do list is going to be in just pure sort of console JavaScript. We're going to be using prompts and alerts. Well, not pure console in that sense. But we're going to be using prompts and alerts. We're going to implement a basic to-do list. We're going to output the to-do list so we can showcase things like arrays and for each. And then we're going to go into making a version of the to-do list in the DOM. So actually using it with things like document, create element, append child. Actually integrating JavaScript with the visuals of the HTML so that we can actually start looking at dynamic website content creation. And then once we create that to-do list, we'll fire up Bootstrap. We'll take a look at some of the components. We'll take a look at how they change once they actually see the Bootstrap JavaScript integrated. And then that will probably be it for today's stream. And then expect more streams in the sort of JavaScript ecosystem in the near future. We may also cover things like Node.js. We'll have a stream on jQuery in the near future. Bootstrap also uses jQuery intimately. So we have a long ways to go, but this will lay a nice foundation, especially for folks who have not used JavaScript in the past. Shoutouts thanks to Blitz, AL0099, Chinaski, YMMH, Cramps Lowell, Satya M, and Taha or how do you pronounce that? Taha Ahmed 80. Thank you very much for the follows. So let's go ahead and transition over to my laptop here. So if I press this key over here, you'll see I'm in Google. And I'm going to let me move this on the screen just a little bit so that I can see what I'm doing as well with all of you. Make sure I'm sanity checking my setup here. So the nice thing about Google Chrome that makes it super nice and easy to develop stuff is, oh, and I also should quit this as well. That was the music that we were playing at the start of the stream. Google actually lets you use the Chrome developer tools to actually code in your browser, which is pretty cool. So if you want to test web pages that already are loaded, or maybe your own web pages, and actually manipulate the JavaScript, this is something that's super useful. And to do this, and I'm actually used to the shortcut, so offhand, I'm not 100% what the menu setup is, but I can sort of guess that I want to view. First of all, let's close it so we can start sort of with a clean palette. So assume that you've opened up a new Chrome window, go to View. It looks like Developer, and then Developer Tools. If you're on a Mac, it's Option Command I, and I believe it's Control Shift I on a Windows machine. I can click Developer Tools here. This we've looked at in the past, for example, the Elements view, where you can see all the divs, you can see all of the HTML elements, then the classes and IDs and all that. The console is where you can actually look at the JavaScript not that's actively executing, but you can look at the JavaScript. You can examine any of the JavaScript objects and variables that exist in that web page. So for example, I could console.log whatever I want. Let's see if jQuery is loaded in here. It looks like it is. So $sign is typically jQueries, what jQuery is assigned to. And most other libraries don't really mess with that. It looks like, if I'm not mistaken, that's this F means that that's a function. In JavaScript, sort of objects are functions. It's kind of a weird thing. But JavaScript looks like has loaded jQuery here in this context. And you can do a whole bunch of stuff. I could console.log my name if I wanted to. Colton, like that. And it does output Colton. I could do 1, 2, 3 for each function console.log. And this actually should take in an E. Console.log E. This should work if I'm not mistaken. I might have messed that up. Console.log. Oh, did I mess this up maybe? Let's try this. Normally this should work. I might have screwed this up. Right, this. Let's try that. There we go. So you can see that I've done an iteration over an array. This is sort of a thing that you might have seen if you're coming from CS50 and you looked at C or other languages like Python where you have lists. You can actually iterate over a list using this function called for each. We'll take a look at that in the near future. But you can see that I have output in my web browser and the ability to sort of create code using an IDE that's not terribly great, a sort of text editor that's not particularly great because it's kind of, this is more like what's called a REPL, so read, evaluate, print, and loop. Where it's sort of allows you to, one line at a time, and this is what you get with Python, sort of interpretively program. But generally, this is not something that you would do for a large program. This is only for testing, generally speaking. Let me go ahead and read the chat here. So never got to understand, so Moonkin says, never got to understand that DOM thing. Can't wait to get the thing done. Yeah, so the DOM, we'll take a look at that. Document Object Model. It's just a way of representing, it's the way the web browser sort of represents your web page in memory in a tree. And so we'll see sort of how that works, at least in terms of how we can manipulate it using some basic functions that are a part of most web browsers come with all these functions by default. And so that is what DOM scripting is. Just another anti-player. I just joined the stream. What is your qualification? Do you have any reference? I mean, sorry, let me read the rest of it. Saying this is CS50 is a bold statement. Interesting. So I've been programming for maybe 11, 12 years now. A long time, a good amount of time. I work with CS50. CS50 is Harvard's Introduction to Computer Science. And it's taught by David Malin. I work alongside David Malin. We started this Twitch stream as sort of an offshoot. My specialty is more in game development, not necessarily as much into web development, but as a sort of an exercise for myself and also just to sort of help provide useful content for more of our audience who isn't necessarily into game development. We've been doing more web-catered streams. So that's essentially our qualification. Just lots of experience, lots of programming. But I am not a JavaScript expert, not even nearly close. But I completely understand your question there. I just don't want other people to think they get a good education, but the guy does not know any. Interesting. So this brings up the question of how do you define qualification, I suppose, in the domain in which you're necessarily looking to get tutelage. So I would say if somebody were asking me to maybe teach them how to develop an enterprise-level application in JavaScript, a front end, maybe something built in React that scaled to millions of end users, I certainly probably wouldn't be qualified to do something like that because I haven't necessarily developed anything like that or have the insight into something like that and all the design considerations. But if you're looking for maybe something along the lines of just showing people how to get started, the basics, how to think in terms of basic programming and computation, I would say that's something that somebody with the right level of experience is certainly capable of doing, and that's pretty much the best that I at least personally can offer. But many of the folks that I work with have, I would say, academically more qualifications than I do. Certainly David at least has a PhD, and I want to say at this point 20 years of teaching experience. So Just depends on your perspective, I suppose. If you're a software engineer and are looking to get some value out of this stream, you probably won't because you yourself probably have the same level, if not more level of experience than I do. But you know, it's all relative. At the end of the day, as long as we can hopefully get some people bootstrapped into the basics of JavaScript, interacting with web pages, making some simple apps, then we'll consider it a success. Currently taking a diploma in game development, says Tempest Station. Do you know how easy it is to switch over to software and application development? Game development is kind of a specialized beast, but I would say that from my experience, having general software and application development transfers over to game development. Games are sort of a very monstrous type of application that with a lot of complications, especially when you're dealing with real-time feedback to your end users and reliable feedback, you know, not having stuttering frames. There's a lot of design decisions that go into implementing engines, modern game engines, things like Unity and Unreal. And it can be tough designing games and making them feel good in a way that's not generally approached in other realms of software development. So I don't know. I would say that games are probably a special class of application development. But yeah. Just another anti player. OK, that sounds good. I like that honest answer. I think setting up a short description for the stream about you and who you are would greatly benefit new viewers to know what to expect. That's fair. We could certainly introduce that. We have a much larger following. So CS50 has a very large following across platforms like Facebook and YouTube. If you go to youtube.com/CS50, and I'm going to assume that you might not be necessarily familiar with our work, but go to youtube.com/CS50, go to facebook.com/CS50, and you'll see there we have established a larger audience and a larger sort of portfolio of projects and videos. David Malin has produced many years worth of full course content, CS50's course content. So take a look at that. That's more, I guess, where our pedigree is established. But on Twitch, it's a newer platform for us. We might not necessarily have that spread. So I understand where you're coming from. I think we could definitely benefit from that. Francis3745, not sure qualifications have to be mentioned. You're going through the basics, which is great for beginners. Although from experience, the Twitch community is really not suitable for developers. Yeah, I mean, I think to anti-player's point, I think definitely having a little bit more, at least textual information here, I think could be beneficial. I do see where he's coming from, or he or she is coming from, and definitely understand. The Twitch not being necessarily suitable for developers, I'm disinclined to sort of impose that expectation or stereotype on the Twitch community. I think maybe the Twitch community has been more catered towards game development, towards game playing and streaming and things like that. But sort of bucketizing it and saying, you know, oh, Twitch isn't suitable for development, it's not suitable for programming tutorials. I don't feel sort of pleased, you know, sort of furthering that kind of expectation. I think we should definitely push expectations and try new things and experiment as much as we can. And I mean, there's plenty of channels which don't even do a lot of game development, which, you know, all of the just chatting channels, and which actually so far the stream has followed that format, I think, more strictly. But yeah, shows your browser history, says Blackbeard0001. Hey, this is a test account, so there is nothing shady. Hey, not that there'd be anything shady on my regular account either, you know, just for the record. As they saying, 12 years, I'll never catch up. No, absolutely, you will definitely catch up. And 12 years, I say that, and I mean, some years are better than others. You can be programming for 12 years and have a year where you're kind of just like, not really learning a lot. And then you can have a year where you're just really focused on learning and getting comfortable with new environments, new libraries, new languages, new tools, new mathematical frameworks. So 12 years is kind of a relative thing. It's someone's 2 years spent well might be more valuable than someone's 12 years spent poorly. And being surrounded by the incredibly smart people here at Harvard, it's become very clear how true that is to me. General question, says Raccoon, why would one use an IDE over a text editor and vice versa? IDEs like Eclipse offer so much functionality, so I don't understand why someone would use a text editor instead. I think it comes down to personal taste. Ultimately, it depends on where you can be most productive and where you can enjoy programming the most. I personally prefer developing in VS Code, and I'm going to fire up VS Code now, just so that we can at least sort of get one step in the direction of actually programming. And this is the code base that we were looking at last year, the cookie clicker code base. I'm going to create a brand new project here. And actually, let's go ahead and create the actual project, which will be in here, dev, streams, and this will be JavaScript. And I'm actually going to just drag this right on over to here so that it opens up. I like VS Code. I like text editors, generally speaking, more than IDEs personally. But I can't argue with the fact that IDEs like Eclipse, like NetBeans, like IntelliJ offer a ton of functionality to developers that are working, especially in statically typed environments, Java-based or C#-based environments. Even when programming in Unity and using something like MonoDevelop Visual Studio, it's usually pretty beneficial having code completion and IntelliSense and other sort of features like that. Profiling and debugging functionality is super useful when you're programming in a statically typed language and you want to get the most performance, especially in game development. That's where I've seen it the most, but it's used all across the board. I used IDEs for a long time, and then I ended up finding that I didn't like how heavyweight they were. There's so much magic going on. I like being close to my code and close to the process, the development process, and so I personally enjoy programming in a text editor in VS Code. And VS Code kind of has hybrid sort of IDE functionality. It has debugging functionality. It has a great plugin system. It has IntelliSense, so you get code signature sort of stuff off the gate and variable completion and a lot of really cool stuff built into it that you don't get with something very simple, a simple text editor. But it's ultimately really up to you. I would say do what you feel better with. If you get more productivity out of an IDE, use an IDE. If you enjoy using something like Sublime or VS Code or Vim or Emacs, then use those because ultimately you being more productive is what's most important. But that's an excellent question. Thanks, Raccoonberry, for the question. VR Game Zone says you should ignore the trolls in the chat, and I wouldn't recommend the chat be on the screen. This is good stuff, and even the young students can get something out of this. To your point, I would say trolls can be poisonous, but I don't think the question asked above was a troll. I think they actually were bringing up an honest concern. And so I actually don't mind questions like that, questions that sort of ask for accountability and for credentials and sort of that sort of thing. I think people have every right to be concerned about this and are curious and really want to know, are they getting a good amount of value out of the people they're watching? Can they expect to be taught the correct information? And certainly I might get things wrong, but hopefully at least by teaching these streams, we'll get a sense of how you can go out and at least figure things out on your own and get the sense of how to program. And Google and Stack Overflow and all sorts of other resources to carry you into your training as a web developer or any other developer, a game developer, perhaps if you've paid attention to the game development streams. If I'm trained in C++, how easy is it to pick up other languages? I've heard people say it's easy all the time, but I have my doubts. C++ is a pretty crazy language. It's very powerful and very flexible. It's also extremely complicated relative to other programming languages. It has a million different syntactical things you can do with it. It has a tremendously expansive standard library. It's a very easy language to screw up in because it does allow manual memory management, although with smart pointers you can sort of circumvent that to a degree. I'm not a C++ expert, so down the rabbit hole of C++ I can't necessarily vouch. But if you're good at C++, then almost I would say any other programming languages is probably pretty approachable. Something like JavaScript, something like Python. If you're not used to dynamic programming languages, it might be a bit of a culture shock for you to go in from C++ or C to an environment where you just have to say var something equals something, or let something equal something, and not say, oh, this needs to be an int, this needs to be a long, this needs to be a byte, this needs to be a short, this needs to be an unsigned int32. There's a lot of sort of different ways of thinking in dynamic versus statically typed languages, so I would say probably dip your toe a little bit. Try Python maybe first. Python's a very approachable language. Then learn JavaScript. Then learn Ruby maybe if that's something of interest to you. Lots of languages, lots of paradigms. What's the prerequisite before learning JavaScript, asks Wakar. Not really much of a formal prerequisite. I would say having some programming experience will be helpful. But we're going to sort of assume the very basics, and actually at the expense or to sort of prevent us from taking too long to actually getting into coding stuff, let's do the very first step into actually getting a JavaScript app up and running. JavaScript program up and running, and that's having an index.html to hoist our JavaScript into and actually run it. So we've done this before. We've had HTML streams and CSS streams and a Bootstrap stream. So this should be pretty standard. If you're tuning in for the very first time, maybe you're not familiar with the world of web programming and you just heard of JavaScript and not sure what goes on, basically you need an HTML page to get you started. The thing that I like about VS Code and a lot of modern text editors, and we've shown this on stream before, is that you can use the simple HTML5 starting point, for example, in VS Code or some analog in another text editor. And if I hit tab, notice that now I sort of have this fully built out basic HTML template that I can then fill out as needed. So we'll just say this is going to be JavaScript test 1. Right? And it already added this script tag, which we haven't really taken a look at before. Notice that we have, for example, a style sheet tag, a link tag, which is referencing a style sheet called main.css. We haven't made that, so it's just kind of assuming we're going to add that. And it's already sort of added this main.js bit here in the script tag, sort of to say, oh, I'm assuming that there's going to be a main.js in the same folder, but I haven't created it yet, so it's not going to actually do anything. And so all I need to do in order to sort of fulfill that is just write main.css here, new file, main.js here. And those are the files that index.html was expecting to exist, and so now I can hoist them up. If you watched the HTML stream, this should all be kind of new or kind of old to you, but if not, this is how you get a basic web page up and running. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are like the trifecta of web technologies that work together. So here in index.html, I have this link, this reference to main.js. It's here in my head, although we'll see that this isn't necessarily great for vanilla JavaScript if you're not doing the right things to ensure that things get loaded in the right order. We'll sort of see that here in a second. In main.js, we can do a few interesting things. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to write alert hello world, which is sort of like the analog of, I guess, saying hello world in Python with print, and we could do it with console.log as well. But I'm going to just do a simple alert that says hello world and load the page. So let's go ahead and load this page up. Once I do that, you can see that this isn't something that we really had the capability of doing before. We really didn't have much dynamism that was possible before. And this is a brand new sort of thing. It's not even part of the page. It's kind of like an extra window, an extra modal, so to speak. And this is just a very basic sort of old school way of saying, here's some information, right? And typically pages these days don't use alerts. And if they do, it's very rare. Sometimes you'll see an alert when you're trying to log into a device, a network device. But that asks you for like a username and a password, for example. But this isn't something that you see in actual web development much these days. Pages like Facebook and most Google pages and YouTube, they don't use alerts. It's generally more, they'll have divs that are dynamic that get inserted into the page, and often you can even move them around and shrink them down and various things like that. But that is the basic way of saying hello world in JavaScript if you're using a web browser. If you want a more traditional way of doing it, you can say instead console.log hello world. And if I refresh the page, you'll notice that I don't get that alert anymore. And actually, I don't get any output. Nothing is visible now. I just see the white page. But if I open up my developer tools, as we showed earlier on the stream, and also thanks so much for the folks that followed. Let me just shout out all of those folks. So we have Seal45, Wakar Sheikh, Albography, Double Cheese 3, and IMSM26. Thank you very much for the follows. You can see that I got back in the developer tools in the little panel there. And remember, on a Mac, it's Option Command I. On a PC, it's Control Shift I. It might be different if you're using Chrome on a Linux box. But now the output is in my console. And this is more akin to how you would do something with the terminal. For example, if we were programming in Python or Lua and we wanted just to output to this terminal here, just to have debugging statements or whatnot, there's some stuff that you might not want visible to your users in your web page itself. But maybe you want as feedback, maybe you want to analyze variables, or you want to do a calculation and display that in your console on page load or whenever you press a button, but not actually make it visible to your end users. And ideally, you'd probably take this out of your shipped application, not make it visible to folks that are maybe inspecting your web page once they've downloaded it. Maybe make this just developer side only. But you will see oftentimes that there are these kinds of messages still embedded in web pages that ship that normally ship. And Graybeard 1970, thank you very much for the follow. Let me make sure I've caught up with all the questions. Just another anti-player. If the new language is an imperative one, then yes, you'll probably get started quick. All you need is to learn new syntax and not logic. If the language is a functional one, you'll probably feel like a beginner again. Absolutely. And actually, I myself am learning Clojure a little bit more in depth, which is a functional Lisp. And it definitely does feel like you are starting from scratch in certain aspects. Certain things are the same. Strings are the same. Dictionaries are the same. But using, just basically composing your applications is a fundamentally different process. It's really cool, though. I honestly am really attracted to functional programming quite a bit. Albography, what kind of code editor would you suggest to us? VS Code or Sublime, Atom, etc. Those three are altogether pretty functionally equivalent. I like VS Code a little bit better. I like the way it's structured. I like the fact that it's very actively developed. It's a little bit less memory intensive than Atom. It's free, unlike Sublime Text. It has IntelliSense built into it, which is cool for being able to analyze all your variables and functions while you're actually programming. It's got excellent plugin support, but Atom has much of the same features and even some other cool fancy features that VS Code doesn't have to my knowledge, like collaborative editing, which I thought was really cool. But yeah, it's kind of up to you. I would try all of them, honestly. Try them all, see which one you like the best, and then use that text editor. It doesn't ultimately matter so much the specific one you're using, as long as you're being productive with it, you're enjoying the process. If you're good at C++, you will learn anything, lol, says Alex Gabrielov. It's almost kind of true. C++ is a pretty crazy language. It's the language, it's sort of like the de facto language of game development, although that's changing because of Unity. Now it's sort of C#. But Unity itself is written in C++, so ultimately it's still sort of the de facto language of game development. Wakar asks, why JavaScript named JavaScript? Is it something related to Java? Not related to Java at all. So at the time that JavaScript was developed, and this is my knowledge, and I would maybe need to research this to 100% verify it, but Java was popular at the time of JavaScript's inception in the 90s. And so the folks developing JavaScript, I believe it was just one person, but I think the name might have been standardized by a committee, decided that in order to sort of market it better, they would call it JavaScript. But the two languages are completely different. Java is an object-oriented, very object-oriented, statically typed programming language, and JavaScript is a sort of dynamically typed pseudo. You can use it functionally, but it's not technically functionally. Prototype inheritance dynamic scripting language. It's kind of a weird programming language. Actually, JavaScript and Lua are very similar in a lot of ways. They both have a prototype inheritance model. They both have first-class functions, which if this doesn't mean anything to you, that's fine. As a beginner, you're not expected to really know what this means. But if you've been paying attention to the Lua stream, the Lua streams up to this point, then some of the JavaScript stuff will actually look kind of familiar to you. Syntax is a teachable skill, in my opinion. Knowing how to write well-designed and efficient code is important. Then when learning a new language, knowing what the language can and can't do is something that comes with practice. Yeah, exactly. Syntax is fairly, I think, straightforward, but being able to take bits of syntax and compile them together to make functional things that work is the harder part. Obviously, composing applications versus being able to read and understand basic syntax, those are, in my opinion, two separate aspects of learning how to program. Then once you've learned one language, once you've learned C, for example, languages like JavaScript are actually very easy to, at a glance, parse. Like for example, if I were to write here in my main.js code, if I wanted to write a function that summed two integers, if I said function sum that took an x and a y, all I have to do is just say return x plus y, semicolon. You'll notice that this kind of looks similar to C. And also sort of to Lua as well because of the function keyword. But notice it has this function keyword for defining a function. It has what you want to call the function. It takes in parameters in parentheses, which is the way that C does it, the way that Python does it, the way that most programming languages do it, Lua as well. It delimits scope with these curly brackets. So this is the C-style way, the Algol-inspired way from way back in the day. Where you have sort of block definitions. I believe Algol did it with a keyword. And then you return, just like in any other function that would return, in any other programming language that would have a function, that returns a value, you can just return the sum of x and y that were passed into this function. And if I say console.log the sum of 10 and 10, well, then we should get 20 outputted to our console. And if I refresh, we do indeed see that we have 20 output into our console. The nice thing about this running these programs is that all you have to do to retest that your program works is just refresh that browser page. Everything is dynamically typed, so you don't need to compile anything like you do in C. You just write your JavaScript file, attach it to an index.html file, as by here, and then in your browser, make sure you load it, and then just refresh it anytime you want to update it. I can refresh as many times as I want to. It's not going to change. It's just reevaluating the JavaScript. So good questions. Yep, and to Alex's point, just marketing. Doing small katas, HackerRank, LeetCode, etc. is good practice for learning new languages. It says Greybeard 1970. We ended up actually hosting some HackerRank sort of programming contests, I think, back in the day. HackerRank's pretty cool. They have a lot of really good stuff on there. I haven't checked out LeetCode myself, though. Are there any downsides to learning JavaScript as your first programming language, asks Dex987. I would say, in certain senses, yes. You'll be getting used to dynamically typed programming languages right off the gate. And this might be a challenge if you decide to work for a more structured programming language like C or C++ or Java or C#, where you're expected to know how to type your variables, how to statically how to define which type your variables should be and to use them in the right contexts. JavaScript does not enforce this, and there are actually a lot of really weird bugs that you get with JavaScript, sort of type coercing your things for you automatically. Adding strings and numbers together, for example, produces weird output. Adding certain data structures together produces weird output. But learning how to program fundamentally, I think you can learn whether you're using a dynamic language or a statically typed language. Even the folks that might have learned C, for example, the folks learning assembly before them might have talked down on those folks for learning a language that to them was a higher level abstraction, right? Because in assembly, you're basically talking with your CPU, plus or minus a level of abstraction. With C, you're actually abstracting on top of assembly, so you're missing out on some of the things that you need to worry about in assembly that you don't need to worry about in C. In Python and in JavaScript and in some other dynamically typed languages like Lua, you're missing out on some of the things that you need to worry about in C that you don't need to worry about in those languages. So it's kind of this infinite sort of like how deep are you willing to go in order to consider yourself well versed at something. Ultimately, I think get a encompassing view of programming. Learn how to program in a dynamic language. Learn how to program in a statically typed language. Maybe look at assembly. Maybe look at how CPUs work, and then you can derive value as much as you want to, depending on how much you're willing to sort of go down that rabbit hole. But it's almost an infinite rabbit hole. It really, you can get down into the really hardcore weeds. You can even abstract below the CPU level and start getting into the circuitry, getting into the electrons. It's pretty, to be productive, you kind of have to pick and choose the point at which you're willing to anchor yourself. Alex says, nope, JS is everywhere and great. And that's true. JS is, right now, a really popular programming language. If you're programming any website, you need JavaScript. If you're programming servers these days, it's very popular to use Node.js, which is a server-side version of JavaScript. And that's extremely popular. And JavaScript is getting used in more and more contexts on a daily basis. I think primarily just because my theory is because the pool of developers is so large that a lot of people are just kind of getting tired of some of the setbacks of JavaScript, hence ES6, which is the more modern version of JavaScript, sort of refining the language and broadcasting it out, refining it, developing tools like the V8 engine for Node. It's just become a very incredible ecosystem. Things like NPM for Node, being able to install so many libraries that so many developers have made freely available to you to bootstrap your application on the server or the client. It's really incredible. So it's not a bad ecosystem to get involved in. I would say there are some weird eccentricities of JavaScript that you'll have to get used to. I would say probably I would advise maybe learning Python first if you're going to learn a dynamic language. I personally like Python more. I feel like it's engineered a little bit better. But it's up to you. Really, just do whatever you feel like doing. OK, let me just make sure that I have caught up here with the chat. There's a lot of chat messages, which is awesome. I don't want to take up too much time, just because I know some folks are eager to dive in. But looks like some folks are talking about their C and C++ knowledge. South Africa asks, will you ever do Python Kivy in your stream? It's very interesting, heavily documented, hard to learn. I built an app but could not implement garbage collection. Python Kivy, I'm actually not sure what that is. Python Kivy, cross-platform Python framework for NUI development. Innovative user interfaces, such as multi-touch applications. Interesting. Let's take a look at their page. This is just a minor aside. So just a kind of like a more modern version of tkinter, I guess, or tkinter, however you want to pronounce that. It looks pretty nice. I have no knowledge and expertise at all in using Kivy, so I would have to dive into it and really learn how to use it well. But maybe in the future, especially if it's taking off, I'm not sure. I am not sure how popular it actually is. Albography asks, what are we creating? We're going to create 2 versions of a to-do list application. I think Andre is a troll. Constructors are nothing crazy. They are standard material of object-oriented programming languages. What did Andre say? If you really get C++ in spite of all the crazy things it has, like constructors, destructors, copy move constructors, or perhaps because of this, I think C++ is probably the language that made me think the most about how things run at both the lower level and about language syntax. So just another anti-player. I think he's talking about, I think Andre, so we know Andre is not a troll. Andre is a very active member of our community. The difference with constructors in C++ versus other programming languages is that there are multiple versions of it that you have to sort of hard code and specify, in addition to things like destructors. And I think that's where he was sort of laying out the difference between maybe C++ and another language. Most programming languages don't specify destructors. C++ is kind of unique in that context. I haven't looked at languages like Rust or Go to see if they do. I know Go actually doesn't really have a traditional object model in and of itself. And Rust I'm not too familiar with. But most of the object-oriented programming languages, especially in the dynamically typed landscape, just have one constructor, like in Python, and it's up to you to sort of use that for all of your use cases. But of course, there are differences across languages. And then, yeah, Andre elaborated on his point a little bit. C++ is awesome, not as messy as Python, in my opinion. I don't know, Tempest Station. I think C++ can get pretty damn messy. I actually really like Python for how clean it is. But if you want to elaborate on what you think is messy, definitely let me know. If you're referring to maybe some of the syntax for some of this, like meta classes, I can get what you're saying. It can be a little bit messy. Would you consider JavaScript an object-oriented programming language? Yeah, I would say, yeah. It kind of falls into a gray area, but yeah, I would say it is. You use what are called prototypes, which is a way for an object to construct itself to reference one object that you've already created, which is kind of acting as a class. It's a very odd sort of way of doing it, but I think it, technically speaking, is an object-oriented programming language. And with ES6, they added class syntax. So you can actually specify a class instead of a prototype, and they made it a little bit similar to more similar to how you would do something in, for example, Python or C++, versus how you would do it previously, where you have to define a prototype and all of the sort of functions thereafter. It can get a little bit odd, though. C++ is an extension of C. Give me a garbage collection thread over having to allocate and deallocate memory. Yeah, I agree. Memory allocation is a real pain. These days, it's so fast relative to how it used to be that it's not as bad. Just another anti-player. The biggest change you see at first is that C++ is object-oriented. Originally, it was called C with classes. Everything you can do in C can be done in C++. There are a few other things like RAII, which is resource allocation. Something, I forget what that stands for. RAII. Holding a resource is a class invariant and is tied to object lifetime. Resource allocation or acquisition is done during object creation by the constructor, while resource deallocation is done during object destruction by the destructor. Yeah, so that's the sort of the C++ paradigm of things. And I think naturally that gets converted into the garbage collection side of things in a more modern programming language. A more dynamically typed programming language. And even Java does this for you, which is kind of nice. You don't have to specify a destructor. It'll actually get taken care of for you by the GC. But yes, to Antai's point, everything you can do in C can be done in C++. You can do anything with any programming language. Roughly speaking, there are sort of ways to do it more easily, but you can do in C what you can do in C++. It's really the goal of C++ is to abstract, to make you think in terms of objects, not in terms of functions, right? And functional programming actually is the opposite. It's you thinking in terms of your data structures and applying operations to your data to get to the same goal. And I'm kind of falling more in love with that idea, but I need to experiment a lot more with actually getting into the weeds with it. So we'll see. Just started CS50 and I don't have any prior programming experience, so what are your suggestions on making myself count in those of the more comfortable category? How should I begin my process and how much time will it take? Being more comfortable is really a process of really just programming and doing it smart. So programming something and expanding your skill set. You know, not doing the same thing over and over and over again. The same basic tutorial example. Actually implementing something that you find interesting, right? For me, it was games. I really enjoyed making games and programming games. And I apologize that we haven't really done a whole lot of JavaScript yet. We have a lot of people asking a lot of questions. I want to make sure that the people tuning in are getting value out of this stream, so we'll have this conversation. But for me, it was games. You have to find what you really enjoy programming, what you really are passionate about, right? If you want to be a mobile app developer, if you want to be a web developer, if you want to be a game developer, if you want to be a systems developer, if you want to program Arduinos, if you want to be a microcontroller developer, you need to find what you like and actually make stuff and make complicated things. And they don't necessarily need to be complicated per se, but you need to keep broadening your horizons, broadening your skill set, and learning the things that make you capable of achieving that, right? I wanted to program games, so I bought books on games. I read how engines at the time, and this was about 10 years ago, were working, 10 or 11 years ago. I got into Unity. I learned how Unity works. I got into Love 2D. I read tutorials. I tried to understand fundamentally what goes on layer by layer of abstraction. And eventually, you sort of fill in all these gaps, especially things like Stack Overflow and Google and all of the great books that are out. You do fill in your gaps, but you need to put in the time. You need to really invest. And you really need to sort of get past the mental hurdles that you will have, because it will hurt. Your brain will hurt for a while. Because it's not easy. It's not easy to sort of think computationally when you're not used to doing it, and to program things that are large scale. But by practicing and working your way up, small things up to large things, you will get there eventually. But you need to invest the time. Java or C#, asked Steve Ronix. I like C# a little bit better, but I'm a little biased because the JVM is what Clojure is built on, and I'm starting to like Clojure a little bit more, so it's hard to say. But C# is what Unity's programmed in, so. Whipstreak saying, "What Python is not messy, excuse me. What's the difference between JavaScript, Java, and JS?" JavaScript and JS are the same thing. Java is a statically typed, object-oriented programming language that runs on the JVM. Completely different language. I would suggest completing the CS50X course in its entirety first, then go back and complete the more experienced P-sets. It took me about a year to complete. Tuxman, yeah, good suggestion. CS50X will teach you how to think. If you work through the whole thing and actually complete all the P-sets, you will get a lot of value out of it. And yeah, I had to look up the RAII acronym. It's been a while since I've looked it up. What would be a good way to learn C or C++ and how to get started? Just Google, I would say, C++ tutorials, watch YouTube videos if you're into visual learning. There are plenty of books and articles that you can find online that will help you. You have to actually work through them, because if you don't work through them, you're not going to actually learn. You have to learn, and here's the other important thing, the really important thing that you need to do if you're using a tutorial, using a resource, reading a book. Do all the exercises. Do them and don't cheat. Look through read through the whole exercise. Do it completely yourself. Using the concepts that you've learned, and force your brain to really get through those tricky parts. If you do that, eventually you will be relative to how you started, much better and much more well-versed, and you will have learned a lot of things. Half of it is just really working through problems and figuring out why things aren't working, debugging, using the syntax and the concepts that you've actually read through. That's important. Do the exercises. Actually, that should probably be like the main point. Do the exercises. But of course, knowing the theoretical knowledge is good too, and understanding how the concepts all work. Graybeard says, "Hope you're not under a time limit." Back to the tutorial. Yeah, I definitely should do that. We have so many people asking questions today, and I know that so many people, especially in here in this stream, might not be very well versed in programming. They might be beginning, and so they want a place to start off. This is a good place to look at, definitely, and we'll definitely get started here very shortly. Okay, it looks like I'm more or less caught up here. So why don't we do a little bit of programming, and then we'll come back to the chat. We'll answer some questions and see what JavaScript is all about. So the first program that I want to implement today to showcase how JavaScript works and some of the basic data structures in JavaScript is I want to make a to-do list. So normally with HTML, if I wanted to make a to-do list, I would kind of just have to specify a UL. Like here, I'll write it out. We'll write out a simple to-do list the way that we might want it to look normally, right? So I'll say div class is equal to a container. This is just going to be our class or our sort of element containing all of our to-do list. I'll say I want an H1 that says this is my to-do list. And I want a UL, an unordered list, and each of these things is going to be my tasks, right? So task 1, li for task 2, and li for task 3. If I save this and rerun it, we should indeed see that we have a very crude sort of to-do list. And even for style's sake, let's just make it look a little bit nicer. In here, I'm going to, in my CSS, define what I want the container class to have. I'll just say that it should be text align center. This should work. And then I don't like these dots right here. So I'm actually going to say list style none for my UL. And then now I have a to-do list with 3 bullets that are static. This is static content. This is not dynamic content at all. This isn't really much of a to-do list because all I can really do is just at the very beginning say, I know that I'm going to want these tasks, but now there's no way for the user to communicate to say that they want to add or subtract tasks from the list. So let's go ahead and this to-do list, the HTML to-do list, we're going to actually implement, I think, as part 2. So part 1 is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a console-based to-do list, right? So this will sort of be my to-do list. Now, in order to make comments in JavaScript, you can do /* and then end it with //. So if I say to-do list version 1 console. And what's cool actually is VS Code will actually automatically put these stars next to your comment signature, which is pretty nice. So let's go ahead and, oh, by the way, Vic J saying, my God, move faster, this is boring, get into details. This is meant for beginners, so if you're already familiar with JavaScript, you're probably not going to get a tremendous amount of value out of this. I would say maybe tune in for another stream in the future where we go into jQuery and more advanced JavaScript. This is going to be very basic. This is meant for people that have no JavaScript knowledge to begin with. I'm assuming that you might have already some prior experience. Oh, Tempestation, what he's doing now is external CSS. Yes, so here in my index.html, I have a link right here that just says the relationship that for this resource is going to be style sheet. And Greybeard saying, basically telling you to shut up and get out of here. Not at all. I would say Vic J should definitely stay around if they aren't familiar. To be fair, we did spend a lot of time on sort of answering questions, so I do apologize for that if that was boring. But if Vic J is experienced, then I would say that they're probably not going to find the value out of the stream that they might be looking for. This, again, is going to be very basic level. To answer Tempestation's question about external CSS, yes, we can absolutely do this with internal CSS, with marking different elements with a style. We could even add a style tag with some CSS. But this is external, which means that I'm actually putting all of the CSS inside of a main file, this main.css file. Because I don't want all my styles to be inside my HTML. I want to separate them. So here I say this link tag, relationship is going to be it's a style sheet, type is text/CSS. By default, it just said media is equal to screen as opposed to print, which you can specify CSS for printed documents and things of that nature. And then I'm going to link to it with this href, which just says that it's going to be main.css as the actual file location. So yes, absolutely. If you have any questions, again, this is catered towards beginning programmers in the web development ecosystem. Let me know if I'm going too fast or assuming too much information. But this is definitely external CSS. So all we're doing is we're saying that the container, everything in the container should be text-aligned center, and then anything that's in a UL should not be styled as a list. Typically is styled with the dots. I didn't like the way the dots looked, so I just said set the list style to none. So it gets rid of the dots. So we're just getting just the text. However, we're going to venture away from that, so we're going to kind of step away from that. That'll be what we have to look forward to, right? Eventually, we're going to have this to-do list, which is interactive. This will be a taste, but first, let's actually get our hands around the basic syntax of JavaScript and some of the basic primitives with a simpler console-based version. Graybeard asks, what if you had multiple lists? Can you set styles for specific lists or elements in general? Yeah, absolutely. If I, for example, wanted to set this list to be ID is equal to task list, for example, and in here I could say UL is equal to, like, where every UL is set to list style none. But if I just wanted that one task list to be set to list style none, all I have to do, because I gave it an ID, is just say hash task list, and the hash just means ID. And so now, not every UL is going to have the list style of none. It's just going to be this particular list. If I, for example, now created another list, and I said second task 1, and we'll just copy this down a few times, 2 and 3, and then I rerun the application, you'll see that the second list now has the styling of the dots, but the first list has no styling whatsoever. So that's just a way of specifying specific elements in your page. You can give them an ID and then use that ID. You can also give them a class and apply the class to multiple things in your page. The ID is meant to just be one specific thing in your page. Is CS50 TV affiliated with CS50? Yes, that is our official page. It's an older page of ours for sort of laying out all of our content. So let's actually implement the static or the console version of this application. So let's assume that I want to let's have this be the UI. I want to prompt the user, and this is another thing that we can do. I want to prompt the user for their task, and once they've typed out all of the tasks that they want to add to the program, I want to quit by pressing Q, for example, and then output all of those tasks in the console. So in my page, it'll basically be, this will be blank, and we can comment all of this out for now. So let's go ahead and just kind of comment all of this out like that. This will be a blank page, and this is all going to be purely in the console. What we're going to do is we're going to get a prompt, which is going to say, add a new task. You can add the task. And if the user entered quit, then we'll stop prompting, and then we'll lay out all of the individual tasks. So we can cover some basic syntax here. Basic array syntax and a while loop syntax, which is very important. Can I watch a replay for this? Absolutely. This will be on our Twitch channel, the VOD, and this will also be on our YouTube channel after the fact. The guy talking is the same guy who teaches the game dev course. Yes, that is me. cs50.xr/games if you are curious. If you're into game development, that course is a more structured course, and then you can follow along with that. And Whipshig is asking, how did I comment that block of code? Very easily. If you're using VS Code and most other modern text editors, if you highlight an entire block of code that you want to comment rather than commenting individually, you can just highlight it all with your cursor and hit Command or Control/, Control/, and that will comment it depending on which programming language you're using. In HTML, it'll add a this sort of less than exclamation point dash dash, and at the end it'll add dash dash greater than. The 1666111 says, love the streams, keep up with the great work. Thank you very much. Blue Booger says, Alt F4 also works. Yes. Now we have a troll in our chat, everybody. So Kappas for Blue Booger for Alt F4. Is there a schedule of upcoming Twitch streams? It says VR Game Zone 1. Yeah, so next week they're actually going to be pretty sparse. We're having 2 streams, and that'll be updated today. So on Monday we'll have a stream with Nick Wong on cryptocurrency, and on Friday, offhand, I actually don't remember what the stream is next week. I think we were set to do I don't remember, honestly. It might be Solitaire Part 3, and it might be something else altogether with one of our other staff. I apologize for not knowing offhand. But that'll be updated today for Monday and Friday. So next week is going to be a little sparse. Will we learn jQuery next week? I mean, will you be live every day or every week? This is fun. Well, thank you for saying that it's fun. I don't remember if we have jQuery on the schedule or not. Let me confirm that. It'll be updated today. Fatil says, text mining or natural language processing from CS50. That's a good idea, actually. We should do something for that, 100%. Those are pretty in vogue technologies. I don't have any expertise in them, but we can maybe take a look at that in the future. What are you using? ATM seems nice. May venture into this from Adam. Oh, what are you using at the moment? Sorry. I'm used to seeing it in lowercase. It is VS Code. So VS Code is super nice. It's a lighter weight than Atom in terms of memory usage, at least per my sort of measurements in the past. And it has a really great plugin system and IntelliSense and debugging and all that awesome stuff. Solid GD says, bro, how long do you spend fixing your hair? Not very long, honestly, just a couple minutes. Your views on programming in the visual effects industry, because I love visual effects. Oof, I don't have a lot of experience in the visual effects industry, to be quite honest with you. Often you'll see that I think After Effects and certain other programs are used in that industry. Ignorant of JS, so apologies if this is a stupid question. I assume you can import in other JS files. So is there a central repository that one can browse and download other open source proprietary JavaScript modules? You absolutely can. There are different ways of developing in JavaScript. So the way we're going to be doing it is just with script tags. So in order to import a JavaScript file into your program, you just need to specify this script tag here. And then you give it the name of the script file. If you're developing locally with Node, compiling your application using NPM, you can actually require JavaScript modules into those JavaScript files using NPM, and you can install new ones with NPM install. We won't get into using Node in today's stream, but if you're curious, look up Node and NPM, and then you can get a sense of how to actually do that. And Remote says, hello, awesome. Cool, so let's actually get started on the beginning of our to-do list in JavaScript. So if you're familiar with C or Python, you might be familiar with the idea of lists or arrays or storing multiple things in one location. So that's probably what we're going to need in order to store a to-do list, right? If I want multiple things, I want to output multiple things, it doesn't really make sense for me to say task 1 to set that as a variable, and then task 2, right? And var is the way to actually set a keyword, and we'll see that there's actually another syntax for that. But if I want to say, for example, my name, or I want to set a variable that says Colton in the variable, like name, I have to use var, right? I could say var name equals Colton Ogden, and then I can console.log name. And what this will do is it will output that variable, whatever I stored in that variable, and it's called var. There is a newer way of doing this in ES6 called let. And let has a little bit of a different set of rules, but what it does is it actually lets you store a variable just the same. It lets you store a value in a symbol called name or called whatever you want, and then you can reference it later. We'll probably use let for the remainder of this demo, just because let is better practice, it's less buggy. Var has what's called function level scope, which introduces a few weird bugs. Let has block level scope. And if you're not familiar with the differences, just think of let as being more similar to the way Python does variables and the way that in Lua, if you've been following the Lua streams, local works. So local is similar to let. Var is kind of similar to not local, but Lua is even more grandiose with its scoping with unlocalized variables. It actually makes everything global. This just makes functions global. At some point in the stream, would you mind touching on TypeScript and the differences between TypeScript and JavaScript? Ooh, I actually don't know TypeScript, but Brian knows TypeScript, so maybe we can get him on the stream at some point, and then he can show us that. I've been interested in looking up TypeScript. I know that it's a typed, hence the name, it's a typed version of JavaScript, but I'm actually in a JavaScript that scales, which makes sense. I mean, everything is a little bit less buggy, I presume. But I have no idea any of the syntax or anything with TypeScript, actually. So looks like it uses functions. OK, cool. So that looks just like regular JavaScript to me. But it looks like here, for example, you can specify that person should be a string. And so at, I guess, compile time, because you are using a compiler with TypeScript, you can enforce that whatever gets passed into here is a string variable. So there's a little bit of type enforcement, which is kind of cool. So this is cool. This is about as much as I know about TypeScript. And it looks like you can define an interface, kind of similar to Java and a bunch of other cool stuff. But I am not an expert on TypeScript. I cannot comment on TypeScript. Cool. Tempestation says, to be able to work as a web dev, to what point do I need to learn? Learned up till jQuery at the moment. The more programming you know, the better you'll be in any domain, I think. But learning jQuery and learning how vanilla JavaScript actually works, I think, is important because it's common to see jQuery developers who know jQuery but might not necessarily know the lower level workings of JavaScript itself. And so you get into sort of weird issues where you might be a great jQuery developer, but if you need to actually dive in and do something a little bit more fundamental, you might run into some problems. Definitely learn as much as possible. And then to Whipstreak's point, we are digressing, so let's 100% get back on track here. Let's go ahead and switch back over to my text editor. So this is how you define variables. We'll use let. You can use var. You'll see var very commonly, but let is the newer way to do it. It's more stable. So this, I say stable in the sense that it's easier to debug using let than is var, just because of the scoping rules. But let's go ahead now and say I want to have a list of tasks, right? And the first thing what we'll do is we'll actually demonstrate how to get user input. So I'll say let task input be the value of prompt. We haven't seen prompt yet, but we'll prompt for enter task, right? And prompt is kind of a cool thing. This actually lets you, very similar to the way alerts work, this actually lets you prompt the user for text input. And this introduces the first step in actually making things dynamic. And this is similar to how inputs work in forms, for example. But I can say do the laundry, right? And hit OK. Cool. We inputted do the laundry, and we assigned it to a variable. If I examine my variable now, I can say, for example, and what did we call it? We called it task input. So if I say task input, we can see that it says do the laundry. The string is do the laundry, right? So it got the value of whatever we prompted the user for, whatever we ended up filling in to that prompt. So we have a couple of variables here. We have JavaScript alerts. We have JavaScript prompts. We have sort of a couple pieces that we can use to do some dynamic JavaScripting. And also, thank you so much to all the people that followed. So let me just make sure that I've caught up here. So Graybeard, 1970, I think I did get you. Killshot, Tempestation, Vargor Turo, Woda Shenzig, CJ LaGuardia, Olga Parfanova, Temort, Minjil X, Sawman, and Lord Henry. Thank you all very much for the follows. Graybeard says, seems like prompt is a low-level method. In JavaScript, can one override this method to change the functionality? It's a function provided to you by the browser. So it's not something that I think you can easily change the behavior of, but typically you won't even use this. You'll use a form in your actual page, and we'll actually see this here pretty soon. Prompt is kind of a 90s, early 2000s way of doing it, but it allows us to demonstrate the primitives here. So this is what we're going to do. And yes, Tempestation says let is the better version of var. Better, or depending on how you look at it, but most people I think would agree that it is more, it's easier to debug. So let's go ahead now. We have the value of our task, right? So we can immediately console.log it, right? Console.log is just a way of printing to your console. In Python, this is print. In Java, this is system.out.println. It's kind of all the same thing. So we'll actually print task input right away. If I refresh, and I'll say cook dinner as my task. Now it immediately, and this is still here actually, so let's refresh this, cancel. I don't want this here anymore. So let's go ahead and hard refresh, cancel. Oh, the console's still up. So there we go. So let's refresh. Now I'll say do the laundry, and it prints out do the laundry. It prints out exactly what we typed into the prompt. So this is actually the fundamental way we can start looking at making our own to-do list, our simple to-do list, right? So we'll say I want to have a list of tasks, right? A to-do list. I want a way of storing a bunch of information together. In Python, it's the list. In Java, in C, it's the array. In Lua, it's the table. In JavaScript, we'll just use the array. So we'll say let tasks be equal to these empty square brackets. And this is a dynamic list. We can actually add to it. So let's go ahead and say tasks dot, and actually I think this is join if I'm not, oh no, it's push. So we say push task input, and this will actually let us push a new value into our list. So I can console.log tasks here at the very end. And I'm not doing any console.logs of the individual tasks, but I'll just console.log the list itself once we've added one element. If I refresh, I say cook, or I say make breakfast, right? Very, very sort of dull themed to-do list here. But now you can see that we've actually outputted not a single string, but rather a list, an entire array, right? So we can see it by these square brackets. We can see that at index 0, and this is something similar to C, for example, where in an array everything is 0 indexed. In JavaScript, it's the same way. Your arrays are 0 indexed. And we can see that at index 0, we have the string make breakfast. Our array is of length 1. And then it's got the prototype of the array object in JavaScript, which just means that it basically is the object-oriented way of JavaScript telling this particular data structure that it's an array and should satisfy and have all of the functionality that an array has, right? So this is our beginning point for how we can create a to-do list, right? We can actually store all of our tasks, not just one string at a time. If we go over back to our code here, I want to make this flexible so that we can add a bunch of tasks. I don't want to just add one task. So to do that, if you're familiar with a language like C or Python, you might be familiar with a while loop. So we can say while, first of all, let's do this in a do while actually. So I'll say do, and then we'll say both of these while task input is not equal to quit, right? So this is interesting, and it might be easier to read in this way. But a while loop just lets us do something over and over again while something is not true or false, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm basically saying, OK, do this, ask for a task, and then push it onto the array, as long as the task is not equal to quit, right? And we can go back over here to our application. And now let's say I want to make breakfast. Task input is not defined. Oh, and this is a problem that we get with block level scope actually with let. So we need to actually say let task input equal to blank string. We're going to use it if we define let in here. It'll actually make it only visible within here. So you would have to use var in this particular context if you want the condition to be able to reference the task input. So instead, I'm going to define task input up above, let right here, and so that now the do has a reference to it, and also the while has a reference to it. Because right now, if we define anything with let, because let has block level scope, remember, it will just get discarded as soon as the do is finished. It won't have a reference to it. If we specify it up here, we can assign it values in here, and that'll still be visible within the while condition. So this is one of the differences between let and var is you have to be kind of careful with this sort of thing. Now, if I said var task input is equal to prompt, and I just got rid of it here, now this should actually work. I can say make breakfast, and then I can say make lunch. And then I can say cook dinner, and then quit. And then notice that here, now we have a four-pronged, or a four-unit list of items, right? I have make breakfast, make lunch, cook dinner, and then quit. And all of those are stored in the array. Even quit, which we don't necessarily want. But we can take a look at how to fix that. I think there is a bug. Please add the first task quit. Can you handle it? So if we go over here and I say quit, or rather let's refresh and quit, it does indeed quit. So that works fine. The issue here, to your point, is that if we want to, and this gets into the next part of the program, if we want to output the entire list, well, we'll see how we can maybe get around it, right? So let's go over back here and actually implement this, right? Because we don't want to console.log the tasks array, because this isn't very user-friendly. As you can see, if I'm outputting this and I'm saying make breakfast, and then blah, 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 and then quit, I'm not getting very user-friendly feedback here of my list. I want to actually display everything one at a time. And in order to do that, we need to demonstrate for each, right? So this is a great function that you get with the array. And this is also a demonstration of first-class functions, which is a very important idea in JavaScript and something that you will see all over the place. And we'll see this actually when we get into our DOM version of this application. It'll be kind of the same thing. If I say tasks.forEach, right? So for each task, I want to console.log it, right? And then Killshot is saying if task input is not equal to quit. Yeah, exactly. We could do that too. That would be the simpler way to do it, sure. So if I said, oh, and also semicolons are optional, which you might have noticed because I don't have a semicolon on this line. But for good practice, make sure you include them, or at least stay consistent. I can say if task input is not equal to quit, then push the task, right? Just like that. And that works fine. There's other ways too. We could just add it blindly and then just output all but the last element. So it kind of depends on what you want to do. Does JavaScript have the concept of break and continue? Yes, it does. Shoot, what was I? I think I was going to make a point. I think I got sidetracked, mentally sidetracked. What was I going to say? Well, we solved at least that issue. Thanks to Killshot, who posed it in the chat. We can certainly do it that way. You can do it other ways. You can splice the array up to the last element. But for each is, what we were doing was we were talking about if we wanted to actually output each individual element of the array, or if we wanted just to iterate over the array and demonstrate how that works, right? The interesting thing about JavaScript is, and same thing in Lua, is that functions are objects just like other data, like strings or integers, right? I can say function in here. Notice that, oddly, I'm for some reason specifying a function on line 18 inside of for each, which is itself a function. So my function is actually taking a function. And the interesting thing, too, is this function actually doesn't have a name. It just takes in a parameter e. And this is what's called an anonymous function or a Lambda function. And this is really cool because this demonstrates that functions are just objects that you can pass around like other bits of data. So it's a very common pattern that you see and makes for a lot of really cool, flexible code. But if you're not used to this idea, this might be a very new concept for you. So I would pay attention to this detail if you're not familiar with it, and be aware that we are actually passing in a function as a piece of data to another function. Can't emphasize enough how much better you are than my lecturer. Thanks, Tempestation. I really appreciate that. It's an awesome compliment. And Graybeard says, especially the hair. He has great hair. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Adamantine says, that's what a Lambda function is? Yes, an anonymous function. It derives from the Lambda calculus, which is a sort of mathematical way of formalizing computation from, I believe it was created, I think it was created by Alonzo Church in the 40s or 50s. I'm not 100% sure. But it's pretty old, and it goes kind of hand in hand with Turing machines and defining computation in the context of Turing machines. I'm learning all this stuff kind of right now, and so it's kind of fresh, but I also don't know all the details. But yes, in the context of most modern languages, when you see an anonymous function, it's also considered a Lambda function. The two are kind of, at least in terms of their nomenclature, the same. In Python, you actually can see this because anonymous functions are literally written out with lambda. You write lambda, and then you write out the function. And lambda functions in Python are not my favorite way of talking about or dealing with anonymous functions because at least per my trials, you can only have one line Lambda functions in Python, which kind of defeats the purpose for a lot of use cases. But yes, Lambda and anonymous functions are one and the same. Immediately invoked function expression, says Neo Chris Assassin. Yes, I think that's the same thing. Immediately invoked function expression. This sort of way of talking about it, I've heard of this and read about it, but it's been a while. Immediately invoked function expressions can be used to avoid variable hoisting from within blocks, protect against polluting the global environment. Oh, this might be more for when var was a thing because of the function scoping. Yeah, that's what the whole function scoping is, with, especially with this and sort of things like that. Arrow functions kind of change this a bit. Yeah, that's what this is. Yeah. So this was a very common thing that you would see a lot with libraries in JavaScript prior to ES6. It might still even be a thing. But you would effectively evaluate everything within the function block so that you didn't have all these variables. Because everything is function scoped, you wouldn't have all these variables that you defined in your library hoisted up into your global scope. It's kind of messy. And that's one of the reasons that function scope is kind of a pain in the butt, right? But ES6, as said here, has let and const, which have block scope, which kind of negates the need for this idea. But the two are separate. The two are related in as much as the anonymous function was used for that, but you use them in different use cases, certainly. I think it's when you write a Lambda and then call it right away. Oh, yeah. That's used too. You can certainly do that for a lot of use cases. But in this particular case, yes, this is a anonymous function that we're writing in this for each. Basically, this for each is a function that when written expects a function that you pass into it, and then just in a loop will just call for every element that function given that element, right? And so we're just writing that function that we're passing to for each that will execute for us every element. And that's what this E is, and that's why I've actually written it as E, because it will sort of inject that element from the array into this anonymous function that you're passing in. And this allows you a lot of flexibility. You can therefore sort of inject, I don't know if dependency injection is the appropriate term here, because that's more used in the context of libraries, and when you have want to update the way things work, and also there's a pattern, design pattern that revolves around this idea that I don't remember offhand. It's not the factory pattern, but I'm trying to remember what pattern it is. It's been a while, but effectively this allows you to put in any function, and for each will work given that function, and therefore for each is a very flexible function that can change its behavior to suit whatever needs that you want. And then callbacks are, yeah, it's a callback function, effectively. For each will call that function. Callback functions are used a lot in asynchronous programming. This is actually a synchronous function, but it's the same idea. You're going to pass in a function that will get called whenever this for each runs and does its thing, right? And someone actually asked a question up here that I missed. Thoughts on WebAssembly? I'm not too familiar with WebAssembly. I know that mscripten, for example, which I think relies on it, has done some really cool things using Unity. I think Unity is written in WebAssembly, and also its WebGL player is written in WebAssembly. And even like Love.js, which was an mscripten project, which compiled Love2D applications, used WebAssembly. I know that there were a lot of higher ambitions with WebAssembly and ASM.js and those types of libraries, but I'm not 100% sure of the state of that ecosystem at the moment, so I can't really advise into, I can't advise terribly well. So it takes in a function and loops for each variable in the function. It takes in a function and loops for each variable in the tasks array. So it's going to say tasks for each task in tasks, run this function and pass in that specific task here and call it E. That's what that's doing. And then, doesn't this potentially cause infinite loops, asks Lord Illidan. No, assuming that your tasks array is finite in size, which it has to be by definition, by the context of being in a programming environment, your tasks array is just going to iterate over however long it is and run that function one time for each element. Now, if you have an infinite loop in your anonymous function, then obviously that'll be an infinite loop. But that's on you as the programmer at that point, not necessarily a design decision of the for each mechanic. What is Ruby on Rails? Ruby on Rails is a web development framework that uses Ruby as its scripting layer and has a bunch of sort of built-in infrastructure for you to build up a web application quickly. But it's a very specific way of doing so. Oh, and not equals equals. That's an important thing to talk about. So we've been doing that here. Not equals equals is basically a way of enforcing that a variable checks not only its type, but the value of the thing on the right. So for example, you could, let's say I have a variable choice is equal to 0. And I want to say if 0 is equal to choice and do something, right? So if the user, this is important if, for example, the user enters string input. So if I am querying the user for a set of numbers, let's say I want the user to enter whether they want to choose number 1, number 2, or number 3, they're going to return to us string data, right? Because the prompt returns a string. So if the user types in 0, it's going to basically do if let's say user choice is equal to the string 0, it's going to be a string, right? Because they've entered string input. It's not going to change that to a number for us automatically. But if we compare that against 0, the number 0 with equals equals, what that's going to do, JavaScript does loose type comparison. So it's going to actually say, it's going to check to see whether 0 evaluates numerically and as a string. So this will actually be true. If this is a string, and this is the number 0, that's actually going to return true, which can cause you problems sometimes depending on what your program is. And now if I say equals 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 choice, that's doing a stricter type check. We're actually checking to see whether it's not only the value but also the data type, whether it's an integer or a number, and whether it equals 0, not just a string that could happen to be 0. So this is a source of some subtle bugs. Generally, the advice is always use triple equals unless you absolutely 100% know what you're doing. It can be a problem. Tempestation JS seems awesome. Unlike C++, don't have to manually include libraries. Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you're trying to do. There are a ton of libraries for JavaScript. jQuery is a really famous one. But to do a lot of things that you would normally have to do in C++ with libraries, yes, it is easier to do things. JavaScript is a more flexible language. You get first-class functions like this, even though in recent versions of C++ this is also possible. Dynamic languages generally offer you a much greater layer of flexibility and a foundation to work on, but at the expense of speed. Generally, C++ programs are going to be a lot faster. They compile down to native code. This is running in your web browser. Still pretty fast, but not the same as not going to be the same speed as C++. JS makes sense if you actually read how it works, but it might seem like it doesn't. Yeah, now absolutely. Like there's the WAT talk. If you're not familiar, with this, CS50 actually uses this. So go to this if you want and destroy all software.com/talks/wat. On your own time, watch this talk. It's an amazing talk on sort of the weird idiosyncrasies of JavaScript. You will be very entertained by it. It is a video, right? It is indeed. I'm not going to play it just to avoid any issues with copyright or whatever, and also just because it's kind of it's going to take a few minutes. But this will show you some of the weird things that you get by sort of using loose type comparisons in JavaScript. That's kind of the main sort of feature of this talk. And to Whipstreak's point, we are digressing again, so let's go ahead and get back up to speed. So now we have this for each function. So let's go ahead and console.log. Remember, we're passing an E from our tasks array. It's getting injected into that function. I'm going to say console.log E. And also, I have to do one thing really fast. David asked me to text him to let him know that we were streaming. So everybody, fingers crossed, and hopefully we'll get an appearance by David in the chat. Now that we've specified that for each task, we should output E, where E is what we pass into this function, which gets injected by this for each loop. It's going to be each individual task. I'm going to run the code. Let's say make breakfast, make lunch, and make dinner, and then quit. Notice that now instead of getting a list outputted to our screen with the sort of square brackets, we actually get a new line separated list of all the strings. We've actually console.log each and every one of them one at a time using this for each mechanic given to us by JavaScript's built-in array data structure. So pretty cool, right? It's a lot more flexible. We could do other things with this, actually. So let's maybe write a function that takes in a list of, or rather, let's do that. Let's say, let's get rid of all of this. So we've made a basic to-do list in vanilla JavaScript, right, using the console, which is pretty easy. Oh, and to Adam's question, where did E come from? So so this function that we're passing in here to tasks, so this function is basically going to, every time this tasks loop basically gets an individual task from task, the for each is basically saying for each task, so I'm going to grab one task, do something. I'm going to grab another task. I'm going to do something. I'm going to grab another task. I'm going to do something from tasks. So it's going for each task. We want to do some function on that task. And we want a reference to what the task is, right? So we pass in E. The actual for each loop is going to inject E into that function for us. And so that's how we get a reference to each individual task. So therefore, we can console.log E, and that will be our task, if that makes sense. So let me know if that makes sense or not. Are lists immutable when iterating through them? What if the function adds to the task list? That's a source of bugs, absolutely. So I don't believe that JavaScript lists are actually immutable. So I think we could do like tasks.push filler, for example, right? And I think this is technically an infinite loop. So if I were to run this and say blah, blah, quit, maybe not actually, tasks. Oh, OK, I guess it looks like it pre-caches the task based on what I understand. It takes in just the task as it was at that point in time when we first actually called the for each loop, and then calls it on just that part of the list. And then it's actually adding and it might maintain like a starting and ending index, and that's what's going on here. But it's not immutable. As you can see, we are adding filler, but it doesn't create an infinite loop, which actually is the case in some programming languages. If you're doing this in Python, for example, this can cause you issues. And shout outs to David for tuning into the chat. These methods are functional, so they either return new array or a new result. These methods are not functional in that case. They're not purely functional. So these functions are actually aren't returning anything. These are performing side effects. These are these are subroutines more so than they are functions, anonymous subroutines. As you can see, we're console.logging and then we're adding to an array. So this is actually the opposite of functional with immutable data structures. We're actually very much using mutation here, which we typically would not want to do in a functional domain if that's what you're talking about. But in this particular case, the list itself, the tasks list, is mutable while you're in this function. So you can actually add, as we saw here, we added filler for each individual time we ran the loop. It just adds it to the end, and presumably JavaScript is calculating the start and the end index before we begin the loop to prevent this exact problem, this exact issue of adding stuff to the list that we're iterating through at the same time, which would definitely cause infinite loops. Map, reduce, and filter, those don't mutate. Yeah, that's a different use case, though. That's certainly different. Mustine 1216, Moby Dig, Sontant, Zishar, Brosif, thank you all very much for the follows. Yes, for each does. JavaScript does not enforce purely functional programming. There's libraries that you can get. Immutable.js is one of them that will do this. But JavaScript you have to enforce functional programming by writing the right functions and using const and things like that. It's a bit of a different ecosystem. It's not a purely functional ecosystem. It's the onus is on the programmer to do things if you're looking to actually program things functionally. And this is an illustration of how exactly non-functional you can program in JavaScript. So we'll do another example here of another for each. So we've done our sort of to-do list version 1, all done in the console using prompt. So we're going to migrate into a DOM version of this very shortly, just to illustrate what you can do with for each again, to make it maybe a little bit more illustrative. I'm going to say let total equals 0. And I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on a sort of anonymous list, an anonymous array. We're not assigning it to a value, although we could. I'm going to say for each on this array, call a function e. And I'm going to say total plus equals e. And what this is going to do is, if you're following along, this should just sum. Actually, people in the chat can maybe guess what this does. If you're not familiar, if you're familiar, don't guess because you probably know. But if you're unfamiliar and this is your first time in JavaScript, tell me what this is going to do. Because if this is your if you're brand new to JavaScript, then this should be a nice exercise for you. E or the total being logged. E is going to plus equal. Oh, whoops, my bad. Yep. Log the total, not E. It will sum all of the elements, exactly, by sort of for eaching all of them, adding that E value, which gets injected from the list. Remember, this value is going to get put into this E part here when we pass this anonymous function into for each. It's going to run this function for every single element, passing an E along the way, right? So it's pretty useful mechanic. Let's go ahead and run this. And we do indeed get 55. So Bavignite, unfortunately, was incorrect with 65, but that is OK. Most people, it looked like, got it. JS isn't really a functional programming language. It's more of a dysfunctional programming language. Shots fired by Andre in the chat there. ES6 at least is a nice step forward, I will say. And lots of love for David there in the chat as well. So we have a pretty good sort of foundation upon which we can build everything. One other thing we can do to illustrate for loops, for example, I can say let elements equal this array. Let's just illustrate what this looks like with a for loop, just so that we can show a more traditional way of doing this. I can say for let I is equal to 0. I is less than elements.length. I plus plus. We'll say total plus equals elements at index I. And then we'll console.log total. Right? This should give us the exact same value. If you're familiar with C or Python, you might have seen, well, Python does for loops a little bit differently. But if you're familiar with C, for example, or Java, or some other languages in that sort of category of imperative programming, imperative object-oriented programming, then you're familiar with this idea of a for loop where you have a counter that starts at 0. You iterate, you increment it basically here as long as I is less than elements.length. In this case, it's going to be of length 10. So it'll go from 0 to 9, because remember, arrays are 0 index. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Going to add total, and then we can console.log it. It does the same thing as our for each version of this program, only with for each, you don't have to necessarily know in advance how large something is. And you have a little bit more flexibility, I think, and conciseness. But you can kind of accomplish the same thing, depending on what you're going for. Is there a problem with doing it the traditional way? No, not necessarily. I would say for each can be a little more readable because you don't have to necessarily. It basically manages this for you with for each, which is nice. You don't actually have to do less than length and have a counter that starts at 0. You just inject an anonymous function, and the for each will actually handle everything, handle the keeping track of the size for you. And this actually gets around that bug that we saw earlier where you can mutate the array as you're going along. This version will probably be an infinite loop if I say elements.push, let's say push hello, or we'll just say 10, right? This will probably break. Yeah, in this case, it looks like, yeah, it's still going. Yep. So it crashed because it's an infinite loop, because we're actually adding to the array within our for loop. So it's more error prone. So the for each actually manages this for you. It prevents you from breaking your own web page. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. Save it, refresh. And then now we have ourselves back to 55. What if you have to deal with the object and the index of the array at the same time? Will the for each work then? I believe it does. I believe there's actually for each index JavaScript. So I think it gets an element and an index as an optional parameter. I have to just remember this 100%. Yeah, because I think you can just do for each, and then let's say elements dot for each function e, and then I, where I is the index. So you can actually see here my IntelliSense is actually helping me out a little bit, which is really cool. This sort of comes with VS Code for free. You'll actually be able to get a direct reference to the index by just passing in another value, which gets injected by for each again into that function, because for each underneath the hood is sort of implementing this for loop for us, right? So it knows the I, so it'll pass it to our function, and we can very easily now just say something like console.log index, and then total plus equals e, right? Or rather I, not index. And then now I can console.log the total, and if I'm not mistaken, whoops, wrong page, you do indeed see that we are outputting the index, which gets injected into the function for us, and we have our total located at the very end. American Sweat, Zia 1994, Twitch Erment, and Xpolar Dreams. Thank you very much for the follows. Why are we doing for and for each again? Asked Whipstreak. We were doing it to demonstrate how to iterate over our to-do list and output it to the string, output a list. And so that's all done with now, which is great. And this is more just sort of lay a framework for fundamental JavaScript programming, right? You need to know how to iterate over collections if you want to store multiple pieces of data into one thing. This is not how I would want to implement a to-do list in JavaScript, though, using the DOM, right? I want a visual to-do list. I want something that I can actually see my lists in the web page and click on them and have them go away and all sorts of features like that, right? So let's actually take a step in that direction, make a more visually interesting to-do list application. This console is not what I'm into, and we're actually going to get rid of the developer tools right now and get into the actual DOM. So the DOM is interesting. There are a lot of functions that come with web browsers for free that you get to use to manipulate your web page as it starts off. So let's go ahead now and figure out what we need to do. Let's go back to our index.html and uncomment this block of code that we did before, and come back to what we initially teased at the start of the stream. And I'm actually going to get rid of the second list because I don't need this list here. This was to demonstrate list style. So I have some static list items here. And I also don't like the fact that we were prompting earlier. So we're actually going to take a look into getting input, not from prompts, but from the DOM itself, from elements, some inputs in our web page. So this is going to be a few different steps forward, not just one or two. So let's go ahead and look at our page here. So I know that I have my h1, which is fine. The h1's not going to change. The ul is going to change. And I don't want these li's here because those are meaningless. Those are just static to-do list to-do items. I want to start fresh in my application. And you could integrate a database with this if you wanted to and make it more dynamic. You could use things like local storage. We're not going to dive into that today, but we are going to show how to get a dynamic to-do list up and running. So I have an ID on my task list, and basically what I want to do is I want a text area somewhere and a button so I can type in a task, click the button, and have a new task sort of added to the page dynamically, which is not something that we could have done before, right? Not with HTML. Normally when you submit a form, that takes you to a new page, right? It's a little bit different. So let's go ahead and add our new elements so that we can get some input from the user. So if I say input type is equal to text and placeholder equals new task, whoops, and then let's say also after that I want a button. which is going to say add task, right? Let's do that. Boom. So now we have a UI that sort of lets us, and it's a little bit small, so I'm going to zoom in just a little bit. So this is our UI for adding a new list to our page, a new list item to our page, right? Now I can type whatever I want all day long and nothing's going to happen. We actually have to tell this application what to do. And normally, because the button's actually not in a form, it's actually not going to submit to a new page anywhere. So we can use this for just adding stuff to our current page. We don't need to worry about going to another page and linking to it and then passing get parameters or post parameters. We can just do stuff on our actual, we can just manipulate the DOM, the document object model, and change how things are, right? So let's bring the developer tools back and take a look at what our DOM looks like. This is our sort of our DOM. This is this is more or less the HTML that we're using. But we have a UL, right? And it's empty. And what I want to do to manipulate this DOM is I want to actually add LIs to this. I want to, every time I click this button, I want to get the value of the text that's in this text box, and I want to create a new LI in this UL that just takes that text and puts it there, right? And I want to just be able to keep doing this over and over again. And what I should also do is clear the text box as soon as I do that, so that we start with a brand new set of text, right? So this is sort of very basic DOM manipulation. This allows us to add stuff dynamically, given click handlers or timeouts and all these other sorts of things, to our web page a little bit more flexibly than we could get with just pure HTML and CSS. JS is single-threaded but can do asynchronous stuff. That is correct. I have a question. Why is no one streaming the Swift language? I don't know Swift, but if somebody might know Swift here, I'll ask around and see if maybe somebody can do a stream on it. It might be something worth learning in the future. I have never gotten into mobile development, but I'll have to take a look at it. Cool. So we have our to-do list sort of frame here, our foundation. Let's go ahead now. And I'm just spacing this out for my sake. Let's go ahead and figure out what we need to implement in our JavaScript to make this work. So let's do that. So to-do list version 2, DOM. What I want to do is basically want to say, whenever I click this button, I want to create a new element on the page, a new list element, and add that to the UL. So you can get references to any of the actual elements on the page, usually by something called getDocumentById. You can also use something called query selector. So this task list, for example, has an ID of task list, right? Aptly so. This button has an ID. I'm going to call it task button. And the input doesn't have an ID, but I'm going to call it text field. So now I have an ID associated with all of the important pieces of my UI. The list, the text field, and the button itself. So now I have a way of actually pointing at the elements that I care about. And I could have also done it with something called query selector, which we can take a look at too. So I can say let text field be document. And document is basically just your web page, right? And this comes built into your web browser so you can get a reference to it. I'm going to say document.get element by ID, and then text field, right? And let me just console.log text field so we can see that we indeed got a reference to it. I'm going to go to the console, refresh, and it's actually set to null. And here's an interesting thing. Anybody have any guesses as to why my document.get element by ID is null? Why it's not returning to me an element? I clearly have in my page here text field ID on my text, my actual input here. So why is it null? Advanced subject, I know, but I'm curious how one would pass messages between pages, e.g. message queues, pub sub. Let's say we both were looking at the to-do list and you added one. I would like to see your addition on my screen. Typically that's done with WebSockets, I think. Two people get established a socket connection to the same page, and then you would basically broadcast a change to the page on that stream, and both people would see it when it happens. And it looks like Adam just also posted that. Lord Illidan, script is running before the button submit. In this case, we're not actually doing anything with the button, but you are in the right track. The problem, and the true Kinesis was saying the text field is empty. That's not actually the problem. It's null because you didn't actually click it. It's not because of a click handler. We're not actually clicking anything, right? There's nothing in here checking for clicking. There's a different issue. I'll let a couple more guesses come by. The DOM is not rendered yet, says Quanix82. Hey, there we go. What was the name? Quanix82. Yeah, essentially HTML works top to bottom, right? So it actually starts in the head, goes down here. It'll actually execute the script and everything inside of it before we even go into the body. So there is no element with an ID of text field at the time of going through our head. And typically the way that we get around this with vanilla JavaScript is we just put our script at the bottom of the page like this. Now if I refresh the page, notice that we do indeed get our input right here. See, the ID is equal to text field. It basically renders the element just as the HTML itself. And Branded David says the same thing. JS code runs before the element is rendered. Adding defer will fix it as well. JL97, if you want to define what defer means, I'm not entirely sure what you mean. But yes, one thing you need to be aware of. Make sure your JavaScript is being rendered after your, being interpreted after your DOM is defined. Otherwise, you will get issues. And you can do document.ready. That is a jQuery thing. I believe window.load is what you do in vanilla JavaScript. Oh, defer, right. A script that will not run until the page is loaded. Defer, sorry, I misread that. Or async might work. Yeah, there are a few ways around it. The simple way is just to put it at the end of your body. So that way, at least the DOM is in place, right? So now we have a reference to our text field, which is great. We can even console.log the value of that text field, but right now we're not going to do that. But now we're on the sort of right track, right? The chat is crazy today. People love JS. Yeah, a lot of love in the chat today, which is awesome. Super happy. Keep it coming. Try to answer as many questions as possible. But I realized that we might have done a little too much of that earlier on in the stream. Should all scripts go at the end of the body by default? Not necessarily. So when you're using something like jQuery or other libraries, they have functions built into them that let you actually specify that your scripts, they have a function that you can call that will make sure your JavaScript gets run at the end of the body's rendering. And there are other things you can do too, like window.onload. You can also check for a particular event and add event listener for DOM something loaded, and that'll actually take care of all of that rendering, or all of that behaving in the proper way. But to begin with, if you're starting off and you're not using jQuery, just put your script at the end to be simpler. VS Code is written in JavaScript? I believe so. I believe VS Code is a Chromium application, so yeah, or maybe not Chromium, maybe Electron, which might be Chromium actually. So yeah, I think it is written in JavaScript. I dislike JS the most from all the languages I know by far, says Bavik Knight. Yeah, JavaScript is a bit of a weird language, but it's gotten better recently, so you know, ES6 is pretty good. American Sweat says Electron. Yeah, that's what I had thought. And I thought that Electron was Chromium underneath the hood. At least Kareem told me it was. So yeah. You need a co-host or a moderator to handle some of the questions or possibly enforce the chat hiding with the less than sign. Yeah, that might be true. Or maybe I should at least get a, maybe focus more on the questions, fewer of the questions. Please stream about data structures and algorithms. I think we have plans to do that in the future. I think Rodrigo was interested in doing that. So we'll take a look at that. And then JS used to be a baby language, but is pretty powerful now. Yeah, it's definitely grown quite a bit. Let's get a reference to the other elements we have. So text field, let's go ahead and grab the button. So let button equal to document.getElement by ID of, what do we name it? We named it task button. And we have task list. Now we could say let task list be equal to document.querySelector, which is cool because this actually lets us pass in a CSS query to get our elements. We can pass in hash task list here. And now we can look for classes, we can look for elements, we can look for IDs, we can look for nesting, we can look for all the same things that we can basically do with CSS. This is essentially a much more robust version of getElementById, but we are not going to be using it too much. We'll just use it here so that we have a representation of it. Making a stream channel in the CS50 Discord might lessen the amount of questions. The problem, though, Kenise, is that I think it's important that people do get their questions actually answered, because if people have questions for me and I'm not answering them, it kind of defeats the purpose of having this be a bilateral system, right? A bilateral streaming setup. Streaming, I think part of the streaming aspect is interaction with the community, especially for people that are confused or need real-time assistance, and also for some of the tangents that we go on, off onto. I think it actually is often educational and helps clarify a lot of things for people that are otherwise lost. If I'm talking to you or talking at you and you're lost and you can't ask me for help live, kind of defeats the purpose of the stream and of making this educational. So I think I prefer having this bi-directional layer of interaction. However, I think sometimes maybe we could tone it back a little bit depending on what we're talking about. It's hard. It's a hard balancing act. Working on it, though. But I'm disinclined to stop answering questions, because then I feel like we stop adding value in the same way, personally. But I can see how folks that are more experienced might get a little bit impatient because of the volume of questions, and that's totally understandable. And I apologize if that's your perception of the stream. Cool. So we have references to the 3 elements that we care about. Now, what I want to do is when the button gets clicked, this is the next part. When I click the button, I want to grab the value of the text field and then add that to an li. So we have 3 different elements sort of talking to each other now, which is kind of cool. We have all these different things sort of interacting, and they're all sort of tied together, wired together. So in order to do that, I can basically just say button.onClick, right? And this is something that's provided to you, but with all elements in JavaScript. OnClick is going to be equal to a function, right? So this is cool. So I can actually assign onClick to be a function, an anonymous function, which we just saw with for each. So sort of these concepts are coming back together, right? And once we click on that button and we get a function, let's actually just test right now. Let's make sure this is working. I'm going to console.log and say button clicked, right? So pretty simple demonstration. Let's refresh. Let's click Add Task. And we do indeed see that I can click this button, and we get console.log button clicked, right? We have interaction now. We have user interaction, sort of event handling, listeners rather, for user input, which is great. And Lord Messieru, thank you very much for the follow. Is there a chance to do a stream on min-max algo? My head is hurting understanding and implementing it. Brian just did a stream or a lecture on that somewhere else. We'll see if maybe he can talk about that. Does Peer.js have something similar to jQuery document.ready? Yeah, it does. So you can do, there's a few different ways to do it. You could do, for example, window.onload is equal to function. And you get the window by default in JavaScript. So I can do something like that, which will basically say onload is essentially called by the window when everything gets loaded. So I can say window.onload equals all of this stuff, and then call all this stuff, right? So again, it's similar to onClick. You can see button.onClick has the same pattern where you assign it an anonymous function. OnLoad, you get to assign an anonymous function. There's also an event that gets fired by the browser, which is more, I think, more supported by browsers than onload. And I forget offhand the exact button or the exact event that it is. I think it's add event listener DOM ready. Let me see. DOM content loaded. So you can say, I believe it's document, yeah. Document.add event listener, DOM content loaded. And what that'll do is that'll basically wait until everything is loaded in the DOM, and then the document for you will actually broadcast this event, which is just, all the event is DOM content loaded. Like everything is loaded, do whatever you want to do with it now, right? And so in this function here is where you would actually pass in all of this code that we're writing in this module. This will ensure that everything runs after the DOM is ready to be manipulated. And this means that we could therefore put this in our head or anywhere in our application, and it will all work. Like we define this at the top of our head, but it only gets fired, only gets executed once this DOM content loaded sort of event gets fired by the document. So there's a few different, and window.onload is essentially the same thing. It'll happen the same way. This is an older way of doing it, this one rather, and just happens to be more flexible. You can add event listeners and specify your own events and fire your own events and have things happen depending on what you're trying to accomplish. But we're not going to do any of that. We're just putting everything at the bottom of our file for ease right now, but that's how you would implement it. So when we click the button, we now know that we actually get a message. We get some feedback, so the button does get clicked. So let's go ahead now and create a new element to be added to our list, right? Shout out to my dad in the chat who said, hello gang, virtual hugs to Irene, Bella, and Andre, and Asley. The birthday game was amazing, loved it. Yeah, my dad tuned in for that. And thanks to my dad for tuning in as well. Shout outs to him, everybody give some love. How is error handling done in JavaScript? Is there the concept of exceptions and try catch? I don't think that JavaScript has exception handling by default. Let me verify that actually. Does it have try catch? Oh, it does. OK, cool. So you can try catch. I didn't know this was actually a JavaScript thing. I rarely see it happen. Probably because it's more of a something that's implemented in a library, I want to say. But yeah, it looks like you can throw, you can try and catch, just the same. So I don't think it necessarily expects a particular exception, does it? Let me see. Try, catch, error. It looks like it just catches an error, and then you have to throw that error here. So you try all this stuff, and then error will become whatever this is in throw, right? So empty will be what error gets in this particular case. Too low, too high. So this is cool. Goes to show you how much I know about JavaScript, right? Apparently not as much as I thought. To design the AI for tic-tac-toe. Oh, right, because I think Brian actually did implement min-max for tic-tac-toe in his Beyond class. So I'm not sure if Brian is paying attention and wants to elaborate on min-max for Farouk and for anyone else. Definitely do so. But I know Brian is probably hard at work as an undergrad. Button.click does not require us to implement bounce time, right? Bounce time, you want to elaborate on what you mean, Tempest Station? I meant more general questions about the stream or ideas for future streams, basic questions that aren't loosely tied to the stream. Maybe even have a general weekly Q&A stream or random technology programming questions. I would say that would work if we were doing more of a full-time thing, but we're probably only going to have 2 streams-ish a week, just because we have only a limited amount of time that we can keep doing this a week, every day during the week. So we're probably going to be like 2 streams weekly, and during that period of time, that's the only period of time people can ask questions. So I don't know, maybe if this were done every day for 8 hours, like a traditional full-time stream, it would be more appropriate. But at the moment, we're going to have to probably be as fast but as general with the questions as we can be. Not related. Anybody here have their gallbladder removed? I got stones but afraid to remove it. Oof. I'm sorry, Alex. That sounds painful. Hope that you all the best with that. I'm not sure if you're being serious or not, but if you are, then that sounds very unpleasant. And I wish you all the best if you're going to get surgery for that. Oh, bounce time as in time to prevent multiple clicking on a single click. I'm not sure, actually. I'd have to do some research on that and see. The web browser probably implements something like that, and there's probably a double-click mechanic in there for event handling, but not 100% sure. Nice. Okay. Awesome. All right. So we've talked about, we just talked about onload. We talked about add event listener, which we haven't talked into tremendous detail, but maybe in the future we'll take more of a look at it and we'll invent a custom event system. Right now what we care about is when we click the button, we want to add a new thing to our list. And so that means that we need to basically take this empty UL, right, if you go back to our page here, this empty UL that's here, right here, it has no LIs in it. We need to create a new LI from scratch and basically tell the UL to sort of add it as a child, we need to make the li go inside the ul so it becomes a child element, right? So let's go ahead and say let, inside of our onClick function, we're going to let li, or new task, we'll say new task equal to document.create element of type li, right? So now we have a new task that we're using a new function that's part of the document, which is called create element. Let's just create a brand new element. It's just kind of in outer space somewhere at this point that we can therefore put wherever we want to in the DOM. So I can then say, for example, task list dot append child new task, right? And this will add a new li to our ul, right? This will take it'll just create a brand new task, and then it'll append it as a child to task list, which is why it's task list dot append child, right? And so let's go ahead and test this out. Let's make sure that we're actually working. This is actually working here. Let's go over here. I'm going to look at my elements view right here. I'm going to refresh the page, and then just going to click on this. You can see that I clicked the button, and it did indeed add a blank li. I can do it again, and again, and again, and again. And this is actually manipulating now our DOM. Every time we click the button, we're adding a brand new element that we created in JavaScript. This isn't something that we had to code in HTML ourselves. This is something that's completely dynamically generated with our button presses, right? So this is cool. We actually have the ability to create new DOM elements. Now the LIs are empty, so we need to actually get that text information, right? So let's go ahead and we'll say let task text be equal to the text field dot, I believe just dot value will work. If I'm not mistaken, it wants to give me node value. I have to, offhand, I can't remember. Let's see, get text from text field JavaScript. And this is the power of Google. Input text value. OK, so it's just a value. OK. So it might just be VS Code messing with me, and that's what's confusing me. But we'll just say textfield.value. And then what we can do is we can say new task dot append child. Oh, well, rather, actually, what we need to do is we need to say this is what we need to do, right? The text itself is actually a different kind of node. It's actually called a text node. And we need to create that from scratch and then make it with the text value from our text field. So what I say is task text gets the value, and then let task text node be equal to document.create text node, passing in task text, right, which we just got the value of the text field. So this will be make dinner, make breakfast, whatever. We have the text string there. And then we actually need to create the node itself, right? And then to our actual task, we need to make the task text node a child of the actual li. We need to make the text a child of the li. So the li has sort of encapsulates that text, right? So we'll say append child of our task text node, right? Just like that. And then we can just add the task itself to the li, which has inside of itself the task text. And if I go back here and I refresh this, if all goes well, I should be able to say make breakfast, add text, and indeed now we have in our to-do list a make breakfast task that's here, right here. Now if I do make lunch, same thing. And if I do make dinner, same thing. So now we have a dynamic list that we can sort of create individual entries from, which is great. We're missing a few pretty cool features, so we're going to actually add a few more. But right now, this is the core of a to-do list, right? We've added the ability to take input from a text field, assign a button some functionality, and have that button update another element, a separate element, in this case, our unordered list. How do you remove one, says Explorer James? So funny you should ask that. That's actually going to be part of the next set of things we're going to implement here in just a second. Tempest Station is going to sleep, 4 a.m. Stream was educational. We'll watch the video released later. Bye. Awesome. Thanks, Tempest Station, for tuning in. Glad you showed up. Please show the index.html, main.js, and main.cs multiple times, sometimes as albography. Sure, if anybody wants to see what the CSS looks like, it's just this. So nothing special, just a container class with text-align center and a task list ID, which just removes the styling from our list. So pretty straightforward. And then the index.html is just the div with an h1, an input, and a button, and then our ul, our empty ul. So we showed this before quite a bit earlier. It's pretty simple. But if you need a refresher, that's what that is right there. Okay. Oh yeah, the React Native course was the React Native course taught by Jordan was pretty awesome. Yeah, I was a fan. Do you know if the whole DOM is re-rendered each time a new li is added? I believe. Well, actually, I'm not sure. That's kind of up to the web browser. I would imagine Chrome probably does some efficiency here where it only re-renders what it needs to, absolutely needs to. I'm not sure. You'd have to dig into the Chrome source code to find that out, I think. Inner HTML. That works for certain things, yeah. I think in this case we only needed value, though. React renders the difference between previous DOM and the new one. Yeah. That's my understanding. I don't have a low-level understanding of the DOM manipulation, or the DOM re-rendering of Chrome and how it differs amongst browsers and how much of that is actually part of the JavaScript. But I imagine the information is probably pretty easy to find on Google. Did we have a stream on CSS before? We did, yep. Use .delete. Yeah, we will. We'll be using actually remove child actually, because is delete actually a function in the DOM? So DOM delete function. I think it's just remove child, right? I don't think there's delete. Is there a delete? Yeah, I don't think there's a delete function, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, to remove a field, sure, but these aren't objects in the same sense, and it won't remove the object, right? Can you explain why we keep using let instead of var? Let has block scope. It's more common now to see it. It's better in terms of your engineering. It's much easier to debug let than is var. Var will essentially be visible throughout your entire function in which it's defined. So even nested variables are visible throughout the entire application. So you can assign something in a nested loop and think that you're only doing something within a block level scope, and you're actually assigning it throughout the whole rest of the function. It can be hard to track where those changes are taking place. With let, it's block level. So nested lets are only within that scope, only changeable within that scope, and only visible. So they actually get, we saw this with the while condition. When we defined a let inside of our while loop and then we brought it out to the while condition, it was actually null. So it wasn't visible, which is more better from an engineering standpoint, easier to debug. They don't hoist, which is true, but I would say that that's probably a good thing most of the time. And most programming actually is, programming is block level. Most programming languages implement block level scope. And is there something like let but constant in JS? Oh, funny you should ask that, Andre. Const happens to be that. So I could say const text field, for example, and it would have the same sort of scope functionality as let, but in this case, it's unchangeable. It's just constant. So, which can be helpful. For elements, you don't necessarily want that to be const, but for functions, you might want functions to be const. You might want some variables to be const. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Cool. So now we have our to-do list implemented, roughly speaking. Let's go ahead now and talk about actually being able to check off tasks, right? Because that's an important feature. That's the sort of next big part of our list. And then we'll essentially have our full to-do list, right? Adam, could you have just used query selector for all the variables? Yep, you could have. And query selector is arguably better for, I would say, all use cases, but there may be a performance cost with query selector because it has to run a search over the entire DOM. I'm assuming IDs get indexed in some way in the web browser for efficiency, so it's probably not as efficient to use query selector for everything, but I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to do some research and figure that out. And then no, const and let, as far as I'm aware, Andre, have the same scoping rules. JavaScript version releases like an iPhone launch, too many exciting features coming all the time. Yeah, that's true. With ES6 and ES 2017, they're definitely doing a bunch of really cool stuff. It's always said that CS51 is one of the best options to go for after CS50. Is there a slightest of chance to have it on edX? I've been asking David for a long time to add CS51, our own version, to edX, but In the short term, it's not something that we're working on, but we'll see if we can maybe encourage the folks to implement it here. We'll see. It'd be a great project to create, though, for sure. Fatil says, thank you very much for your time. We're also looking forward to the text mining and natural language processing. Yeah, no, I'll see what we can do with that. I'm not 100% sure when we can actually implement that. Somebody has to put a stream together for it because I'm not an expert on it, but we'll see what we can do. Cool. So first of all, what I want to do, here's the UI that I want to implement. I want to add a radio button here. What I want to do is inside of the LI or the UL, each LI I want to have a checkbox, right? And so this is cool. What I can actually do is say let checkbox equal document.create element input, right? And then I can say checkbox.type is equal to checkbox. And then, so this is essentially what I've done. You can do this in HTML, of course, with input type as checkbox. It's just a checkbox that you can click on and off. What I want to have happen is to do this. I want to have one associated with each and every LI that I generate in my click handler right here, right? So I can say new task is append child. So right now, what we've already done, we're just appending the text itself, right? The LI with the text, or just rather just the text node. But before the text, I'll add the checkbox, and then I can have both of them. So I'll just say new task.append child checkbox, like that. And if I rerun the page, and I add make breakfast right here, notice that now my LI also has a checkbox associated with it that I can check on and off, right? Pretty cool. So you can see how you can dynamically do whatever you want, right? You can assign whatever. Farouk J, are closures going to be touched on today? Probably not. We're going to have nested anonymous functions. Well, actually, yes. I think technically speaking, we are going to be talking about closures. In the context, we're not going to be discussing them in depth, but we are going to be using a closure. So that's actually a good point. And can you assign the label via a script? If you're referring to this, yeah, you can. So I can say in here, once we click on the, once we click on all this stuff and I assign it all that, blah, 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 I want the actual task text to be equal to, or rather, I want the text field dot value to be equal to nothing, right? So I can do this. I can say make breakfast. Now watch the text field. Once I add the task, it gets cleared. So now it's ready for a brand new task. It doesn't preserve make breakfast anymore. So now that's actually been changed dynamically as well, just by assigning it, right? That's all we have to do. We just assign the value equal to an empty string, and then it just functions as before. And notice that it even gets the placeholder filled back into it too, which is a nice, cool side effect. So good question. Now, what I want to have happen now, we have the checkbox. I want to click the checkbox, and I want to strike a line through my element. I want a visual sort of indication that that element is gone, right? So the way we can do this is I can say checkbox dot onClick is equal to function. And then this is kind of where the idea of a closure comes into play, because this anonymous function, even though it's anonymous and even though it'll be called sort of asynchronously, it's going to have a reference to all of these variables no matter what. So this is kind of what a closure is. It's a function, anonymous function that has access to the scope above it, right? Which is cool. So that means that we can do things anonymously. We can sort of add this anonymous functionality, but also have our environment, have a sort of a frame, a snapshot of the environment at all times. So this is pretty cool. Are you going to touch on event propagation? Probably not in this stream. We're not really even covering events too much, but yeah, no. In this case, no. And do closures have to be anonymous? No. We could define a function here if we wanted to, called function click is equal to blah blah blah, and assign this onClick to click, just like this. And that would be the same. It would be the same. Oops, sorry. Getting arrow functions and normal functions kind of conflated there. But no, in this case, you could just define it right here like that, function click, and then just assign it as a variable. Again, functions are first-class citizens in JavaScript, so you have this ability to assign it to fields just like you would any other variable type, like a string or a number, right? I personally prefer just using an anonymous function, especially because we're not going to reuse it anywhere. So that's what I'm doing here. So when we click the function, what I want to do is I basically want to say new task dot set attribute, I believe, and then style. And then this is sort of a way that you can dynamically change the CSS of your program at runtime using JavaScript. You can set the attribute, the style attribute of something, to something else. So I can say text decoration line through. And so what this is doing is this is actually getting a reference to new task, whatever new task is right here, right? And setting its attribute to text decoration line through. Right? And this works for every time we click the button. This will be that specific task that we're worried about, right? Because of closures, which is to Farouk's point, right? So this is pretty cool, Farouk and M4 and Ju. So now if I go back here, refresh, make breakfast, which I never do, by the way, add task, and then click this, notice that we do indeed have a line being struck through our make breakfast text. We're actually applying a CSS attribute at runtime using dynamic the dynamic setting of that attribute, right? It's pretty cool, right? We're getting closer and closer, but we haven't deleted our tasks yet, right? So I can make lunch, add task, make dinner, right? But I don't want make breakfast here forever, right? Maybe I want to add make breakfast again and uncheck it, right? And by the way, make dinner works on itself. Make lunch works on itself. So everything sort of works nicely. But I actually want to delete the attribute. So how do we do that, right? How do we actually manipulate the DOM so that I can get rid of elements? We've added elements. How do I remove elements? And this is kind of cool. So using something called window.setTimeout, you can actually specify something to happen after a period of time, right? So I can actually specify this function to happen after 1 second. I can say, let's say, document dot, or rather, in this case, it needs to be the UL, right? So the task list, because we're going to delete a child, right? This is the way that you delete elements in JavaScript. You need a parent element, and then you need to say remove child, right? So let me just make sure that I have this correctly. So remove child, yeah. So you basically say, and actually, can you do this? Isn't there a way to do it from the element as well? Can't I say new task dot remove child? I guess it's just remove child, which is fine. So OK, so we'll just say task list dot remove child, and we'll pass in new task. So if you give a element and then you call remove child, you can pass in the element that you want to remove that's a child of that element, and it'll just remove it. It'll just take care of doing it for you. Because it maintains a reference to all of its elements. So underneath the hood, it can basically compare pointers and say, oh, that's the same child. So delete it from the list, right? So what I've done here is I basically said, I'm going to set a timeout function. So a timeout just means after 1,000 milliseconds, so on whenever that times out, I want to run this anonymous block of code, this tasklist.removeChild new task, right? So once I go back here, run this, let's do make breakfast, make lunch, and then make dinner. And if I make lunch, after a second, we do indeed see that make lunch disappeared, right? It's just gone. So pretty easy, right? Is there a difference between setting a var to a timeout versus just calling the timeout? I have to, let's see, set timeout return value. I have to remember what this is for. I'm not sure. I guess it looks like you have to use what are called promises, which are asynchronous JavaScript. This looks like a more complicated use case, I'm guessing. And it's actually wrapped by another function. Yeah, you wrap the timeout in a promise, then you can return it. So I think it's a little bit of a different use case, if I'm not mistaken. I don't see it very frequently, but I'm sure it's used in certain contexts a little bit more. Remove child seems a bit extreme. Is there a get child to do homework function, though? Oof. That one hurt a little bit, Andre. Could you maybe give a quick tutorial on how to read API documentation that pops up when you write a method in VS Code? Maybe take window.setTimeout as an example. Oh, OK, sure. Why don't we do that? So if I were to write window.setTimeout, you can see that it gives me a little bit of information here. So this is a little bit cryptic, but in this particular case, it's saying that it expects a handler, which is a timer handler, which is a function. Handlers are usually functions. They handle something. And then the timeout, which is optional, it looks like, hence the question mark. And then it takes in a number, and then you can pass in other arguments. And then it returns a number, which is, well, actually, I guess if it returns a number, maybe that's more of what somebody mentioned that. I forget, who was it? Shoot. Who just said that? Oh, Juban. So it looks like it does return a number. Maybe, so what? Maybe I had this wrong. Maybe I looked this up incorrectly. What does set timeout return? Oh, OK. So a timer ID. OK, interesting. Oh, so that you could, OK, I see. I know what it's for. So you get a timer ID from set timeout. So this is the difference. I was missing this for some reason. If you call set timeout and return to a variable, for example, if I say local clear timer is equal to window.setTimeout. Oh, sorry, I'm using Lua syntax. If I say let clear timer be equal to window.setTimeout, and by the way, this is not going to be very useful in this closure because let is block level, so it's not going to be visible. But let's say I have it somewhere where I do have other bits of code that I might want to use to clear this timer out. You can associate, and maybe you have a global object somewhere that you're storing references to all of this, so you don't even need to use let. But you can assign a return value from set timeout, which is basically an ID, an identifier that lets you say, at any point before it times out, you can clear it. You can say timer clear. You can say window.clear timeout, or well, I think it's clear timeout, right? Yeah, clear timeout right here, and pass in the handle for it, that ID, and that will stop the timer from running in the future. And we've used a timer library that does something similar to this in some of the game streams. But this is if you have a timer that maybe you want to abort its functionality at some point, you can return the ID linking to that timeout function. So that's what that is. Yeah, ID so you can cancel it, exactly. You can do a new task, .parent node, .remove child if you want to remove it without using the task list element. Ah, yes, right. That makes sense. Yeah, and then set interval that you usually want to clear with clear interval later. That's correct, yeah. Set intervals for something that you want to have happen more routinely. That I could see being cleared more frequently than timeouts, because timeouts just occur one time usually. All right, let's go ahead and add one last feature to this. So right now we can remove elements, but I want a little bit fancier of a removal, right? So what I can do in my CSS, and I have to make sure that I actually get this right, if I do li, and then I say opacity is going to be 2 seconds, I think, and then transition, is it transition? Oh, no, it's transition opacity over 2 seconds. And then, wait, is that what it is? I think that's what it is. And then I can do, first of all, we don't need this reference to clear timer anymore. So then we'll go ahead and I'm going to say new task.set attribute of the style of the to be equal to, I'm trying to remember exactly what this is if I'm doing it from scratch. This is, I believe, opacity. Oh, you know what? I think it's opacity. Oh, right. No, I think it's opacity 0, right? And then this gets opacity 1, and then this gets set to duration over 2 seconds, just like that, right? I think that's how it works. Shoot, I need to look this up. I apologize. So CSS transition duration opacity. Do we have a bit of code here? OK, so opacity. Oh, right. OK. Opacity gets set to. OK. So opacity is going to be. I had this all mixed up. So opacity is going to be set to 1. And then the transition is going to be opacity over 2 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? Yeah. And so now what we can do is we can say set the opacity to 0 for the style. And what this is going to do is it's going to actually interpolate over duration the opacity, because we set the transition to opacity over a certain period of time. This is a CSS animation. It's a little bit complicated. Even I had to Google it because I don't remember it offhand. But if we go into here, I'm going to set this actually to 2,000 milliseconds when we check the checkbox. What this is going to do is we should be able to refresh this, do make breakfast, make lunch, and make dinner. And then if I click make lunch, notice that it actually faded out before clearing, and it actually didn't set the text decoration, though, which is unfortunate. Why is the text decoration not? Oh, wait. Why did the text decoration not show as line through? That's strange. I did this yesterday, and it seemed to work. I mean, I don't mind that it's not struck through, and I don't know if I have time to debug it, but that's weird. In any case, now we can get things out of our to-do list using a transition, a CSS transition, right? Which is pretty cool. And you just have to set the opacity to some initial value. So set it at 1. It goes from 0 to 1, where 0 is invisible, 1 is completely visible. And if you set the opacity, if you set the transition, right, on opacity to be 2 seconds, any changes that you make to opacity are going to apply over 2 seconds, right? So if I change the opacity to 0 here, because we had duration set to opacity in 2 seconds, this opacity to 0 is actually going to be an interpolation. So it's actually going to go from 1 to 0 over 2 seconds. And that's why I'm also setting this remove the element from the task list to be 2 seconds as well. So the two kind of happen at the exact same time, and then they're gone, just like that. And then as he's saying that's cool, Magrafina saying whoa, Adamantine saying that was buttery. Make it do a flip before disappearing. I do not know how to do that. I'd have to Google that and feel about that. I think the screen had to refresh before the opacity was changed. Oh, maybe. People watch Netflix at night. I'm watching a CS stream and enjoying it. Almost 1:30 a.m. here in Pakistan. We'll watch the rest later. Have a good day, all. Thanks, Farouk, for tuning in. Much appreciated. Glad you enjoyed. Hope to have you begin soon. Nice. Oh, Whipstreak was saying, how did you guys do that to the birthday stream? Yeah, it was pretty sick, wasn't it? I was a huge fan of it. Particles, lots of particles. Yeah, there were a lot of those birthday particles were some good particles. I was a fan. Well done in the particles department. That concludes our to-do list. Now, really briefly, one of the things that I also wanted to do was just add a bit of Bootstrap, but JavaScript to Bootstrap. I wanted to show you how it kind of changes and how you can kind of make a little bit more complicated stuff. We won't go into too much detail. I don't have a concrete. I think I'm going to show you carousels and some of the drop downs and show you how to integrate that and show how it works. But in a future stream, what we can do is have a project-oriented stream where we maybe build a whole web page using Bootstrap and dynamic JavaScript and all kinds of fun stuff, so we can actually see how things work. Why does it turn null when I add a new task, Albography? I'm not sure, Albo. I'd have to look at your code. I imagine if you're copying the code with me, there's probably an error in your code somewhere, a syntax error. So I would just debug and look through it a little bit. See, console.log, the stuff as you're writing it out. Make sure everything is scoped appropriately. I can commit all this. I can commit at least what we have here to GitHub, so you could clone it if you're interested. So what I'll do is I will cd into dev, into streams, and then JavaScript, get init. It's not a whole lot of really meaningful. I mean, it's cool. It's a cool, simple to-do list. So it's not. But it's, you know, if you want to download this and clone it and test it out, then you can figure out maybe why your code is different. Compare your code with the code that I'm pushing and see where the difference might lie. So we'll say final to-do list, remote add origin, and then I need to actually create the repo in GitHub. So we'll do that. My mouth is extremely dry. Not anymore. All right. Let's go ahead and add a new repo. JavaScript stream on JavaScript on twitch.tv/CS50 to-do list. Stream on JavaScript on CS50 TV. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, cool. And then I'm going to grab this link here. Go back here and add that as the origin, git push upstream origin master. Now, if all of you want to download this to-do list and mess around with it on your own machine, you have the power to do so. I'm going to write in the chat github.com/coltonoscopy/JavaScript stream, just like that. Nick Slisarenko, could you tell us about binding context for prototype methods, please? I know that they're function level, just like var is, if I'm not mistaken, but the weeds of that we're probably not going to get into in this stream. Maybe in a more advanced JavaScript stream, we'll implement a sort of a class hierarchy in JavaScript prototypes so we can discuss it. I would say nowadays you might want to transition to using the ES6 classes, which I think cover, have a few less issues with it. At least related to function level scoping, because everything is I think everything is block level scoped now with classes. So it should be, I mean, classes are technically still a layer on top of the prototypes. It's just a kind of a syntactical conversion. But look into class syntax for ES6 and mess around with that and see how that works. If you mean everything works fine, but only the text appeared null, had the same error, it turned out that I set text field dot node value instead of text field. Oh, I see. Right. Yeah, that's what I did too. Thank you. Let's find my mistakes. Syntactic splenda. Yeah, there you go. It's kind of, yeah. That's fair. That's fair. Oh, and thank you to all the people that have followed. Eliazin, Cruiser1, mgrow, and Saja95. Thank you very much. To repeat, set attribute overwrites the style, immediately destroying the text decoration. Ah, okay, interesting. So why don't we fix that then? Let's go over here to, wait, text, set attribute overwrites the style, immediately destroying the text decoration? Wait, how is that if we are literally doing that? Right. Oh, I see what you mean. Right, yeah. So we need to say opacity 0 here, just like that. Right. Yeah. So now this should work, right? If I say make breakfast. Yep. Nice. Cool. Shout out to Humble Pie for the fix there. I forgot that you have to do it in one call. Otherwise, it will just sort of refresh the style to completely from scratch. Forgot about that. Totally good thing to consider. Let's commit that. Fixed set attribute. Awesome. All right, so let's add Bootstrap to our program here and just mess around with a couple modules real quick before we conclude, since we have a little bit of time left here. So I already have Bootstrap here, I think, in my CSS. Do I? Oh, no, it's in the actual Bootstrap thing here. Oh, but it's not there. Let's see. Where was it? Did we make... did I not have Bootstrap? Oh, because we were loading it in the... right, because we were loading it from the CDN. Right, we can do that. That's fine. So we'll go over to get Bootstrap, grab the CDN links, download. Okay. let's do this. Just going to add the link in the source. So if I'm not mistaken, this should just work by default regardless of where we put it, because all of Bootstrap is within jQuery, and I think they wrap their entire thing in a document.onReady. So this should work already by default, but we'll see. Let's actually add a brand new folder here just to get started. Bootstrap JS test, and let's load that into here. Great. And we're going to create a new index.html. Whoops. Index.html, just like that. And then we'll create that starter boilerplate. Going to go into here, copy and paste the Bootstrap links, which now we should have Bootstrap and Bootstrap the CSS and the JavaScript built in. So this is cool. So let's go ahead and just mess around with a couple modules. So we'll go to components, go to carousel. That's one that's pretty easy to test out. We'll go to this one, for example. So we're just going to copy and paste. So this is the carousel example. A carousel is just something that lets you span images left to right, right? And we're not going to go into the detail on how this all works. You can watch the Bootstrap stream if you're curious. We didn't really cover carousel into too much detail, but the basics should all carry over. Let's go ahead and just make sure this is all indented properly, which I think it is. So if I run this now, if I'm not mistaken, this should just kind of run with a, is everything messed up? Let's see. Refresh. Why is this but interesting? Oh, is it because we're not linking to the images and it broke, perhaps? Oh, right, it expects image sources and we don't have any. Right, that's what's causing it. So let's go ahead and add some Pokemon images to stay with the theme of last week's Bootstrap stream. So let's grab this Bulbasaur image, cute image. Actually, let's copy image address. We'll go into here, do that. And then let's grab Bulbasaur, or let's grab Squirtle. Which is this. Copy image address. Notice that I'm just kind of filling in the blanks because Bootstrap nicely gives us all this documentation for all of its modules, but if you know the right things that you care about, you can just kind of plug and play the parts that are specific to what you want. In this case, I want to use the carousel feature, but I want the specific images that I care about. And Alex Gabrielov says, check out javascript.info, great for starting JS. I think somebody mentioned that to me before, actually, javascript.info. So yeah, it looks like it covers a lot of really good stuff. So if anybody in the chat is interested, definitely check that out. And thanks to Inquisitor for the follow. Appreciate it. Okay, so we have Squirtle, and then lastly, let's get Charmander. Looks like they already have it recommended to us. Let's grab this, copy image address. Back over here, source is this. And then now, is it going to work? Whoa, hey, that's a little bit large. Okay, let's make sure that this is set appropriately. Are we not loading the JavaScript in here appropriately? That's what it looks like. Excuse me. It feels almost like we don't have Java, or we don't have, sorry, we don't have the, we don't have Bootstrap loading in here appropriately. So let's make sure. I might have been wrong about it loading it at the start. So let me just, as a sanity check, make sure it's loading. I'm going to say h1, and then I'm going to say Bootstrap test, just like that. And actually, I'm going to div classes equal to container. I think this might help us a little bit too. Apologies for the fumble here, but we'll fix it. Let's make sure this works by itself. Whoops, wrong page. Oh, was I? No, I was refreshing that. Okay, refresh. Okay, so it is working. Okay, container text center, right? That works. Oh no. Do I have this mixed up a little bit? Let's see. I've already forgotten the Bootstrap container text center. I thought I had that right. Did I not have that right? Well, in any case, let's go ahead and now get rid of the commenting. Let's see if now it works. This is odd. Oh, we do have the, OK, we have the buttons. They're just hard to see. But they don't actually do anything. OK. So let's make sure. OK. OK. So I think maybe this does have to be put at the bottom. Let's try this. Shoot, why is this not working? This is very weird. H1 is not in the container. H1 is out. Oh, H1 is outside of the container. Whoops. Live debugging for the win. OK, do that. Blip. Refresh. OK, cool. I thought I was going crazy there for a second. I'm a little confused as to why this is not just working. I thought this just worked. I apologize. Do I need to refresh, hard refresh the page? Why is this? This is so strange. Carousel not not working. Bootstrap. Here's where the real development comes. Let's see if there's any obvious ones that people do wrong. Okay, we definitely have the CSS, right? That's here. Yep. Cool. CSS, yep. Oh, shoot. OK, need the plugins. Forgot about that. jQuery, JavaScript plugins, jQuery, and tether near the end of your pages right before. OK. That is my fault. OK. If you're building our JavaScript from source, it requires util.js. Let me see. Go back to documentation, go to JavaScript. Where is the tether? I'm guessing it's tether. Bootstrap tether. Oh, I see. OK. jQuery and then popper. Interesting. And popper, I guess. OK. Cool. So we'll add those. Boom. Boom. Now this should work. Fingers crossed. There we go. Thank goodness. OK. Wow, that was horrible. Sorry about that. Forgot that we needed popper and jQuery in the page. But yeah, that's the sort of functionality that you get. Now, there are clearly certain Bootstrap modules that require other JavaScript files. The regular JavaScript's not going to work for some things, like the carousel. It shows a bad example. Though one of the examples that does work, I believe, without any of the side libraries is, for example, dropdowns. So you can import just the regular, just a regular dropdown like this, for example. And before, I don't believe you were able to actually click the dropdown and have it do anything. So let's go ahead and just plug this right into here like this. OK. Apologies also for how brutal that was. It was a pretty silly mistake. Now, and VZHD and Marrowware, thank you very much for the follows. So here's a dropdown, just copied and pasted from Bootstrap's documentation, which if we have everything right, it should just look like this, right? So action, another action, something else here. And if we disable all of our JavaScript, which we'll do right here, I'll actually comment all of this out so we can see the difference. if I'm not mistaken, this should just give us a drop-down that doesn't actually do anything, right? So I click the drop-down, but it doesn't actually have any dynamic functionality. We can't insert new elements, because when it renders the new panel underneath the drop-down, you're actually getting it's actually adding new things to the DOM, right? When you're clicking the drop-down and you're having a new sort of set of links pop up below it, that's not always something you can do with CSS, right? Or raw HTML. You have to actually be adding new stuff to the page in order to have that visibility. Or I mean, you could maybe do it with some like active stuff, active and hidden stuff. But if I uncomment these script tags, right, and I refresh, and I click on this button, now you do indeed see that it's dynamically injecting sort of new stuff into the page. It has this action, another action, something else here. Those things have hover attributes on them so that we can get some visual feedback. So this is sort of like the kind of the behavior that you can see by adding the JavaScript part of Bootstrap into your application correctly, unlike what I did the first time without Popper. But assuming that you've done everything correctly, now almost all of the widgets have some kind of small JavaScript capability associated with them that you can also now fine-tune and tweak and use for your own use cases. You can make alerts pop up and fade away dynamically. You can shrink badges and grow up badges and shrink them. You can make cards move around on the page like I did with Masonry with the CS50 staff page. You can make tooltips appear. You can make progress bars animate. You can do all kinds of awesome stuff. And then Lord Illidan's asking, does it work now if the JS links are in the head? And I think it should, actually. So let's go ahead and copy this. And then go over here. Paste those three. Save it. Rerun. And then click and drag. And it does indeed seem to work. If I click and drag, or if I copy and paste the carousel example again, well, actually, we should still get this first one working. We'll do it with Ctrl so we can manually adjust it. Let's go ahead and do this. Boom. Copy this right in here. Copy paste development for the win. Oh, interesting. Does not seem like it is working. I mean, it's definitely doing something. It's moving stuff around. That's weird. So it's actually not working when it's at the top of the page, when it's at the head. Fascinating. Oh, is it because there's no images here? That might be why. I'm not sure. That's a weird bug. It might still have to be at the end. Let's see if we just copy this over at the end, at the bottom of the file, and see if this does the same thing. Let's see if this works. Refresh. No, it still doesn't. OK, it still doesn't work. Interesting. Is it because there's no images? I haven't tested it without images. You would think that it would just work because of this raw image, this raw example here, right? Like you would think that this would be. I don't know. We'll say ... and then we'll add maybe 3 images of Charmander. Let's see if that Bulbasaur fixes it. Very weird. Copy image address. Go back here, fill in these source blanks. OK, let's rerun this. OK. I think it just causes issues if you don't have images. For some reason, it's like looking in the wrong place for it. So now if we have images, let's take a look. Let's do it with the scripts here. Let's bring those to the top. Refresh. OK, so now it seems to work. So carousels are bugged without images, FYI. What if you put hash in the source? Let's try it. Let's do that. Boom, boom. Hash, refresh. Nope, still looks like it's bugged. Refresh, seems to work there. So, it's a little touch and go. But it looks like you indeed can put it in the head so long as your widgets are laid out appropriately and you actually fill in your widgets with the right information. But yeah, that was JavaScript. we covered the basics. We'll probably do some streams in the future where we make a full website using more dynamic stuff. And also do want to get into semantic UI and foundation and those kinds of frameworks. Semantic UI in particular, I think actually seems pretty cool. But I think that's where we're going to wrap up today. So let me go ahead and just boom, move us back to the main page, main shot here. If we have any last questions, I'll stick around for a few more minutes. This was meant to be a very beginner-friendly introduction to JavaScript, so hopefully we didn't go too fast. We might have gone too slow. Confusion regarding head might come from the fact that jQuery needs to be loaded first. True, although jQuery, as long as jQuery gets loaded, I had thought that it was integrated with bootstrap.min.js with the newer versions. Maybe not, but not sure. Frederick says, when's the crypto stream? Next Monday. So this next Monday we'll be doing a crypto stream. Usually we'll be posting that today. Can we make every new task with a different Bootstrap alert and color? Absolutely. You can do whatever you want. Really, the sky's the limit. Once you know how to use Bootstrap and how to actually look for the right elements and the right styles for your web page, you can do anything you want to. It's ultimately up to your taste at that point. I had actually the same idea as I was looking at the alerts in Bootstrap. They seem to be fitting for different different tasks in your to-do list. You could even theme them. You could make maybe urgent tasks you could color red, and less urgent tasks yellow, and in completed tasks green, maybe. Whatever you feel like doing. JavaScript being JavaScript again. That was more. I feel like that was more my fault of not putting the image in the source. I find Bulma a lot better framework than Bootstrap. It has understandable class names. Yeah, I haven't taken a look at Bulma. I should probably take a look at it maybe. Any streams for functional programming in the future? I would love to do one. I need to study it a bit more. I have other folks that I've talked to that might be worth getting on here to do some functional programming. We'll see if they end up having time to do so. And also thanks to Actinistia, Cypher TV, and Holy Black Sheep for the follows. Can we have a session on GraphQL? That'd be interesting. I've wanted to learn GraphQL for a long time. We'll see if folks might be amenable. Lord Illidan says, thank you for the stream. Much appreciated. Thanks for tuning in the whole time. Can we do Node.js as well, asks Lord Illidan. Yeah, I would like to do a Node.js stream. That's the plan. No concrete time frame on it. Like I said, we're probably going to be cutting back to 2 days a week. So we'll see what we can get done with that limitation on time. But expect it in the future, for sure. Everything worked fine. Thanks a lot for the awesome stream. Now finally get the DOM dude done. Get the DOM dude done. Nice. How have a strong CS fundamentals by learning on your own? How do you get a strong CS fundamental background is what you're asking, Killshot. I would say read. There's plenty of books out there on programming languages, plenty of books on higher level concepts like theory of computation, functional programming. Expand your horizons, work on large problems, read books on data structures and algorithms. There's plenty that you can do teaching yourself. All of CS you could teach yourself. Just spend the time on it. Moonkin saying almost 6 a.m., but worth the time. Awesome. Well, glad you stuck around for so long. Thanks so much for tuning in, even though it's 6 a.m. That sounds like it's going to be a hazard on your sleep schedule. Are we going to have a stream on React Native? Maybe. We have so many ideas, which is great. Really like it. We'll have to find how many people can be up to it. Do you know if there is a guide for people learning JS coming from C++? Offhand, not man. I'm not sure of a specific one. But I think just going to W3 Schools, for example, is a great website, if that's the correct one. It should be W3 Schools, right? .com. That's an excellent website for learning how to program HTML. Oh, excuse me. HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So tune into that website, look at all the articles. You'll see it has everything kind of laid out for you on the left-hand side too by category, which is really nice. And it's a very approachable ecosystem. I mean, especially if you're used to a very structured environment like C++, where everything is very sort of touch and go and easy to mess up and crash and burn. JavaScript is much more forgiving. So easy to introduce bugs that are hard to find, but it's much more forgiving. You must blame the JavaScript like everyone. Can we have a session on Kubernetes, says Bahari Web. I'm actually not familiar with Kubernetes myself, but again, we'll see what we can put together for people. Maybe start a poll for the next topic for the stream. Yeah, we can maybe do something like that. First of all, I need to find people that have a multitude of topics that they can sort of talk about, because I only know so many categories. I have to learn all this stuff kind of from scratch if I want to teach it. So if we wanted to teach GraphQL or Kubernetes or any of these technologies, I'd have to learn it. So it might be easier to find people that know it in advance. JS will just crash and burn at runtime, says the Geek Pirate. Yeah, sometimes. Forgiving or giving headaches? Kind of both, Bave, kind of both, but good pun. What's your favorite tag, says Killshot? At the moment, it's Clojure. So take a look at Clojure. I think Clojure.org. I think that's right? I'm learning it. It's a functional programming language. It's a Lisp. It's got it runs on the JVM, so it's pretty fast. But it's a very fundamentally different way of thinking about programming that I've been trying to get into for a long period of time. And it seems to be pretty well engineered, but I need to take more of a close look at it. But that is what I've been spending my spare time on. Aside from learning web dev and stuff like that, I haven't gotten into games for a while. I would like to program more games. It's been a while, but we'll see what we can do. I do a lot of game programming here on stream, so that kind of itches that a little bit. What's the main use for Clojure? Anything, really. It's also Clojure script is great. You can use it for client-side web development. But it's meant to just be it's used a lot for server-side development, for application development. Clojure script is probably a larger pool of it, which is it's a version of Clojure just interpreted into JavaScript, so it runs in the web browser. It's pretty sweet. So take a look at it if you're interested. What about OCaml for functional programming? I actually don't know OCaml, but we teach it here at Harvard as a language for, we teach it here as a language in 51 for functional programming. So I'd have to take a closer look at it, but I'm sure that and Haskell and ML and all these other languages, F#, yeah, all kind of strive towards some of the same goals. A drop-in replacement for Java, kind of like Kotlin? Yeah, it's a JVM hoisted dynamic language, just like Kotlin, except it's mostly purely functional. I'm not too familiar with Kotlin, though. Golang and Rust, yeah, I've been wanting to learn those as well. Go, I've started learning. Rust, I started a long time ago, but I haven't actually looked at it for a long time. But so many people love Rust. It's worth looking at a little bit. Wish I had more use cases for it. Yeah. I've been wanting to get more into a functional programming state of mind and actually do it more religiously, I think, just to actually start thinking about solving problems, I think, a little bit better, and engineering problems a little bit better. So many people and so many companies are really investing in it, and it seems like it's taking off, and it seems like it has such a foundation in good engineering principles that it seems worth the investment. And at the very least, it's a different way of thinking about programming. And our newer languages like CoffeeScript, PureScript, all JS-based. They all transpile to JavaScript. But CoffeeScript, like the Geek Pirate said, it's pretty old. It shipped with Ruby on Rails a long time ago. I was programming in it in 2014. Many people were programming in it before me. Do you think it's worth learning some web dev even if you have no intention of doing it professionally? Probably not. If you have no intention of doing it professionally, I would say focus on what you have intention to do professionally first and foremost. As an exercise in understanding how the web works, sure, it's great. Don't spend too much time doing things that you don't think you'll actually do, though, because you only have so many hours and minutes and time to spend on this planet. You might as well spend them in the way that makes sense to you. Try Haskell. It's so strictly functional that it just forces you to do everything functional. Yeah, that's the plan. I have tried it a little bit. I'm probably going to spend some time programming in the future. I know that James Carmack implemented Wolfenstein in Haskell and said that he wasn't a huge fan of it. But I'll see how it is. At what age did you start programming? I was 15. So So 13 years ago. That's touching, says Blackbeard 0001. Yeah, there's a lot of languages, Raccoon. It's not important to learn all of them, though. Learn the ones that are relevant to you and your interests and the ones that you're passionate about. Don't try to learn everything. It's hard to learn every programming language. And, oh, excuse me. Sorry. Don't mean to yawn. I'm a little... Caffeine, I think, is wearing off. I took a caffeine pill earlier, and now it's wearing off. Mac versus PC for web dev. I like programming on a Mac generally, but I do both. So it's totally doable to do both, and they both work pretty roughly the same. And especially now that you can get Linux subsystem for Windows on Windows 10, you can get a Linux type environment, which is the kind that you get for Mac in your Windows machine. So really, it's up to you. They're totally both viable, though. I've used them both. And then the Geek Pirate also says Linux. Linux is good, too. And Andre, I meant not to say that Haskell is terrible, but that for that use case, it wasn't as great as John Carmack was hoping. He said, if I remember, that he was hoping that the Haskell reduced the code base and the sort of the intellectual overhead by quite a bit, but it ended up actually not being worthwhile. But Haskell on its own has a lot of great things that let you think about problems differently and can condense a lot of stuff. Life advice from Colton. Yeah, not really. Just how I sort of feel about life. WSL, it can be buggy at times. Yeah, I haven't used it a lot personally. We use it actually here for our PC that we stream on so that we can host a Linux script that is broadcasting the cross stream to Facebook or to Twitch and to YouTube, so that we get two at once. But yeah, WSL still lacks some native Linux terminal, but still can do stuff. Ours on here seems like it has a pretty close to parity Linux terminal that we've used. It's just running Ubuntu 18.04. But if you mean maybe some of the utilities are missing, then yeah, I'm sure there are. There's a few differences between them that are definitely meaningful for some people. For a lot of, terminal functions, yeah. Some are missing, as far as I know, that I have heard of, but the core is present. All right, any last questions? And then we will wrap for our JavaScript basic stream and tune in next week for Nick on crypto. And then I forgot the Friday stream. It's a week in advance, so we'll be posting that all today. How many hours do you program a day, asks Sohai. Not very many, I would say. On a typical stream, we're coding for 3 hours, but on a general day, it depends on whether I'm programming or not. Some days I program, some days I don't. On the days I program, 3 to 4, maybe. Depends on what I'm doing. Depends on if it's for work and if it's for personal stuff, too. But some days 0, some days 3 to 4. Really depends. And Noah Asley saying thank you. So awesome. And Bavik saying thank you. Thank you all for coming in, for joining us on today's stream. Would love some Postgres sessions. Yeah, maybe somebody knows Postgres. I know Brian knows Postgres. Brian knows a lot of stuff. I just got to get him in here. He's got a limited set of time, so it's hard to get him to come into the stream. Blackbeard 1, see you, mate. Take care. Thank you. Thank you, Sarul, Remote, Knitman, Bavik, Raccoon, Killshot. What do you use for front end? What do you mean by that, Killshot? I'm not sure what you mean by that question. And Aktanisha, thank you. Igor, Moonkin, Andre, Killshot, Abography. Abography, I'm personally trying to learn Clojure, and I program games personally. Lotjor, thank you very much for the follow. So yeah, games and learning Clojure as of recently. Games just tends to be what I generally tend to prefer. Oh, Killshot's asking for frameworks. I don't do a lot of web dev. I'm still learning, but React is probably what I want to end up learning. And then specifically, there's a Clojure library called Reagent, which is a wrapper around React for ClojureScript. And so that is something I've been taking a look at recently, which I think has some potential. With the use of Figwheel, which allows you to actually live reload and run and REPL execute your ClojureScript in the web browser. It's pretty cool. So, but I'm very, very beginner level with all that stuff. So don't expect too much amazing things from me. What do you put in your hair? A little bit of blow-dry gel, wax pomade, messy look pomade, and hairspray. ClojureScript is essentially Clojure for the web. That's correct, Andre. It's a version of Clojure that runs in the web browser that transpiles to JavaScript. Correct. It's not like JavaScript and Java. ClojureScript is actually Clojure. And King440, what the WTF are those? Just a different language, if you're talking about Clojure. Thunder4471, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate it. It's looking like we're probably close to the end here. So thanks again to everybody who tuned in. Hope this was educational for some folks. This was CS50 on Twitch, JavaScript Basics. Tune in next week for crypto and more details to come very soon. Once again, thanks, and it was a pleasure having you all and doing some live debugging, as always. Have a great weekend. See you all soon.